Good morning, everyone. It's now 10 o'clock and this hearing session is open. My name's Roisin Barrett. I'm a Chartered Town Planner. I've been appointed by the Secretary of State to carry out an independent examination of this plan. That's the Winchester District Local Plan 2020 to 2040. This hearing session and those that have previously taken place and subsequent hearing sessions into the week beginning the 2nd of June are part of the examination process that started with submission of the plan in November of last year and will end with submission of my report to the council. Jill Taylor is the programme officer. Many of you will have been in contact with her already. She's working independently of the council at my direction and is responsible for all administrative arrangements for the examination. If you've got any queries about the running of the examination or administrative queries, please speak to her. You can contact her, either grab her in an adjournment or through the website, or her contact details are on the website. Please can everyone turn laptops and phones to silent, please. Toilet facilities are on the 2nd floor. Please follow the signs. We're not expecting a fire alarm today, so if it does sound, please out this door, follow the green signs to the meeting point in the car park, isn't it? Abbey Gardens. In the Wickham room, if you do the same, follow the green signs to the meeting point. Please avoid walking in this area. That's because there's a trip hazard with lots of leads. If you've got your laptop on charge and you've got a lead behind you, could you please, when we adjourn and people are moving, could you just pull the lead in to avoid a trip hazard? I expect everybody to have read my guidance note agenda. I've produced a hearing programme that's been updated as we've moved along. I've set out some questions that I want to focus on in this session in an agenda that was posted on the website. So my role in conducting the examination is to decide whether the local plan has been prepared in accordance with the requirements of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 as amended and associated regulations, and whether it meets the tests of soundness set out in paragraph 35 of the NPPF. And I just want to remind you of those, because those who are opposing the plan or want changes to the plan, I'd like you to refer to these tests of soundness. And those are: 1, that the plan is positively prepared, providing a strategy which as a minimum seeks to meet the area's objectively assessed needs; justified, an appropriate strategy taking into account the reasonable alternatives and based on proportionate evidence; effective, deliverable over the plan period and based on effective joint working on cross-boundary strategic matters; and consistent with national policy, enabling the delivery of sustainable development in accordance with the policies in the framework and other statements of national planning policy where relevant. Okay, so my starting point for the examination is the assumption that the council has submitted what it considers to be a legally compliant and sound plan. And that's why it's important that those considering any changes need to demonstrate why it isn't legally compliant or sound. So if I conclude that the plan is not legally compliant or sound, the council won't be able to adopt it in its current form. The council's already suggested a number of main modifications, and those have been updated as we've gone along. Sorry, has anyone got the reference to this? I think it's SD14A, and that has been amended as we've gone along. Those haven't been subject to consultation, etc., and that's why this is the plan I'm examining. And I will be putting questions to the council as to why they consider that those main modifications are necessary. I just want to set out my approach to emission sites. Part of my task is to examine the soundness of the approach to the plan's needs, including sites that are allocated for development, and those who have put representation to the effect that a site is unsound will be able to put their views to me if they've made a request to do so, and of course the council will have an opportunity to respond. Sites that haven't been put forward for inclusion in the plan are known as emission sites informally. It's not part of my role to examine those sites, and I wouldn't intend getting into the detail of those sites at any of these sessions. However, should the situation arise that I'm saying to the council, you need to look for additional sites, I will turn to the council first of all to do that. Though they will put forward, the council will put forward any additional sites necessary, and they'll go through the process in the usual way with the usual rigour of consultation and examination, etc. So what I intend to do, I've got a number of questions. I'll spend some time with the council first of all on each of my questions, and then I'll turn to the room and I'll ask if anybody else would like to contribute. I've already got a note of the representations you've made, so I want you to expand on those. Now, when you want to speak, if you turn your nameplate up like that, I can see that you want to speak, and I'll bring you into discussion at an appropriate time when you finish speaking, if you wouldn't mind putting it down. Can you also make sure that I can see the name on it? Some people are familiar to me, but others are new to the table, so just put it so that I can see it, and I'll be able to read it if I've got my glasses on at that point. Any other matters we need to consider? Right, just one housekeeping matter. I've had notification that there's traffic on the M3. There's very bad tracking, an accident, and so a number of people are delayed in attending. Now, I've asked the programme officer to for those people to indicate what they wish to speak about. We haven't been able to contact them all, but there's a strong indication that many of them want to speak about the settlement gap policy. That's NE7. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to delay that discussion. If we do get onto that by our mid-morning adjournment, we'll take a mid-morning adjournment, but I will say that I'll deal with that policy. I won't deal with that policy early in the morning. We'll wait until we have an adjournment, and if we see people come in, we'll know that they've got through the traffic problems. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? Let's move on then. So today this morning we're dealing with policies in relation to biodiversity and the natural environment. And that's a suite of policies starting with NE1, and that's the strategic policy, and then under NE1 we have NE2 to NE17. And what the council say to me is that we set out a strategic framework in NE1, and then we've got those policies underneath that provide specific detail. So could I please turn to the council first of all? Could you explain to me the plan's strategy for the natural environment and biodiversity? And as I said, I understand the framework of what you've got in the plan, but can you explain to me what the strategy is, please?
Thank you, Mum. I'll just reintroduce myself. So I'm Emma Betteridge, Principal Planning Officer in the team, but I'm also supported here by several officers within the council that will respond at different points. So In terms of strategic policy, NE1, it provides the overarching policy framework and strategic approach for promoting protection and enhancement of biodiversity and the natural environment as set out in paragraph 7.23 of the supporting text. Policies NE2 and NE17 provide the detail as to how that's going to be implemented in relation to various aspects of the natural environment, for example, biodiversity, nutrient neutrality, etc. And it considers there's various aspects of the natural environment that are set out in policy NE1 in providing the overarching framework, such as ancient woodlands, which are irreplaceable habitats, and these are explained further in policy NE15 to provide that policy hook. So therefore we consider that it's a robust and logical approach to the protection of biodiversity and the natural environment in terms of the strategy and the local plan.
Okay, so you've got NE1 that is your overarching policy. Can you explain to me how that meets the requirements of the necessary legislation, the Section 40 of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, and supports the principles in the Environment Act 2021, which are the critical things?
Thank you, Mum. In terms of meeting the I'll just go back to the question in terms of national policy as well. I think that's really relevant. So the City Council considers that the strategic policy NE1 and its supporting text are considered appropriate in terms of Section 40 and the Environment Act, and also in particular Chapter 15 of the NPPF, which is referenced in paragraph 7.10 of the supporting text to the policy. Policy NE1 refers to protecting and enhancing the natural environment. All designated international, national and local sites reflecting their status in the hierarchy of nature conservation designations in line with paragraph 181 of the NPPF, which states that plans should distinguish between the hierarchy of international, national and locally designated sites. The policy also refers to the protection of irreplaceable habitats, as I just mentioned, such as ancient woodlands and local ecological network, which is consistent with paragraph 186C. Policy 1 is also supportive of development that conserves and enhances biodiversity and geodiversity and natural resources, which is consistent with paragraph 180D of the NPPF. The policy, in particular, criterion 4 refers to the best practice principle of the mitigation hierarchy in line with paragraph 186A of the NPPF, and it also refers to conserving and enhancing ecology and the air and water environments, which runs through the Chapter 15 of the NPPF also.
And what about the acts? Okay, so that's the policy. What about the acts, the requirements of those acts?
So as stated, I think as stated in our response, we're content that it meets those acts as a whole because it provides evidence within the policy that it meets the principles such as the Environment Act that in relation to biodiversity net gain. So it sets out those principles, particularly in relation to as well as the suite of policies, policy NE5.
Okay, so okay on the Environment Act, and I don't mind who answers this question. Explain to me, because you say in your statement that it provides evidence that it meets the duty placed on it by Section 40 of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act. So I don't mind who it is. Can somebody explain to me in what way it provides that evidence?
Hi, Mum. I'm Zoe Goldsmith, Principal Ecologist.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to provide a bit of extra clarity. So the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act covers things like protected species and priority species, which is covered in the biodiversity policy NE5. And it also, that act places the duty on the council to consider biodiversity in all things it does. So we feel like the overarching policy NE1 and the policies throughout the natural environment section do meet that requirement.
Okay. Okay, so we've said that you've got an overarching policy, NE1, and then you've got many policies below that. Now, some of them include repetition. Some of them, for example, you've got a policy about landscape character. Well, you've got NE1, then you've got landscape character, then you've got rural character, then you've got well, settlement gaps, you could argue that that's specific to me. There is repetition in them. Can you tell me, does that go to the heart of soundness? What? Yeah.
Mum, I think it does really go to the heart of soundness, because it's providing, although policy NE1's providing that overarching framework, it's really looking at the detail in terms of each individual aspect of the natural environment. So it's providing appropriate detail for those planning applications to apply in relation to applicable development.
Yeah, but okay, so you've got a policy with regard to the GI framework, so green and blue infrastructure. Then, as I said, you've got something that talks about open space, protection of open space. You've got NE1 anyway. Then you've got something that talks about new green space, and it's all, most of those policies have got the mitigation hierarchy in them again. Can you comment on that in terms of effectiveness? Does it go to the heart of effectiveness? That's really what I'm trying to get at.
In terms of the mitigation hierarchy, I think it's relevant really for each.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
But do you have to say it in a number of different policies? That's what I'm getting at.
Yes, and I think the approach that we've adopted, and we've had this issue on a number of occasions, is the approach that we've adopted is we have some general principles, and then we apply them stage by stage to each relevant policy area. Now that's a logical, and we say user-friendly approach, which people who are using the plan can and see not only the general approach that we take, but also how it translates into those particular areas. And if there is a degree of repetition, as long as there isn't conflict, and I don't think at any point, respectfully, we've identified conflict between or inconsistency or ambiguity, there's no harm in terms of the effectiveness of the plan of stating the requirements in more than one place in a logical manner, because one has to consider the alternative, which is if it's stated just once somewhere, and then one looks at, as it were, the residual bits of policy which are left for each individual policy area, but you don't state a principal thing because it's been stated somewhere else and you've done everything you can to avoid repetition, you're much more likely, and I would suggest, to end up with a plan which is actually confusing for users. And so we would say that the interest of clarity and the ability to use the plan in a logical way, that if there's a degree of repetition, as long as I say there's no conflict, that's not a problem. Certainly doesn't render it ineffective.
Okay, and I'll say again, I'm not here to improve. I'm only here to get to the heart of soundness, and if it affects soundness and effectiveness.
And bluntly speaking, it doesn't, and that it's something that, you know, it's a matter of style. And the substance is as sound as it could be.
Okay. Okay, I've raised the issue of valued landscapes in NE1, and this is something that the CPRE talk about, have put in reps about. It also comes up in NE10. So the nub of it is that the NPPF does indicate, does refer to valued landscapes. You don't in the policy. Could you please explain that approach and why you have taken the decision not to refer to valued landscapes? Sorry, would you mind turning your...
I'm so sorry, Ma'am. Is that better?
Yeah, thank you very much.
So yeah, Stuart Dunbar, Dempsey Council's Landscape Officer. We've actually prepared a response to this under NE9, and I'm just going to sort of try and read through that as quickly as I can. So our response to this question of valued landscapes is that, well, yes, whilst the MPPF would allow for valued landscapes to be designated in the local plan, there's no actual requirement for the local planning authority to do so. The term valued landscapes is not actually defined anywhere in the MPPF or the accompanying guidance, and the council considers that the landscape of the district will actually continue to enjoy a necessary degree of protection from speculative development through the existing countryside policies. So NE9 landscape character and NE14 rural character. The council has a proven track record of successfully defending appeals through similar policies in the adopted local plan. So formerly CP20 and DM23. I think that's our view on valued landscapes. Additionally, it's been considered in case law at appeal. I'm sorry, and I think the conclusion, what inspectors have been concluding, is that just because a landscape isn't designated doesn't mean to say that it could actually be seen as having value or being sensitive in some way. So whilst we rely on our existing countryside policies to protect the district's landscapes, there are instances where, particularly at appeal, we have sought to demonstrate that the particular site or its landscape could actually be classed as being valued according to the tests. Forgive me, I just need a sip of water. The guidelines for landscape and visual impact assessment, the GLIVIA, sets out a table of the sorts of criteria that should be considered when assessing whether or not a landscape is valued. I haven't got that in front of me, but it's a table 6.1, I think, in GLIVIA. It's used quite frequently in appeal decisions, and that runs through a list of criteria which help councils determine whether or not a site and its landscape, whilst not being designated, could actually be termed as being valued. And I have a previous appeal decision from last year where the appeal inspector agreed with the council that whilst the site and its surroundings weren't designated, they were of sufficient sensitivity and could be classified as being valued according to these criteria.
Okay, so previous plans have identified areas, have they not?
A long time ago, Ma'am, yes. I mean, back in the early 2000s.
And that was stripped out. So just explain to me the rationale for strip that out.
So the rationale was that the government wanted councils to move on to a character-based approach to protecting landscapes. So rather than identifying areas that were more special than other areas, it encouraged local planning authorities to adopt this character-based approach. So we have a landscape character assessment, which describes the differences that exist between different areas and the key components in each of those landscapes. What it doesn't do is actually make value judgments.
Well, exactly. So what
between areas.
So you've got the two, you've got the landscape character assessment, haven't
Yes,
you?
yes,
And then you've got the Winchester City and its setting.
yes,
yeah,
again,
so-
which is
so-
a bit long in the tooth, but is still a robust document, yeah.
And what that does is it indicates what's distinctive about areas, but it doesn't go on to evaluate them, does it?
The landscape character assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It identifies what is distinctive about each area, but it doesn't actually assign a value to it. But I think what the council are saying is that on a case by case basis, we can apply a set of criteria which are being used nationally in view of the fact that the NPF doesn't exactly define what a valued landscape is. We're turning to the guidelines which actually decide.
And you're referring to Glivia Table 6?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there are instances where we say the harm to this landscape will be more significant because it is a valued landscape according to these criteria, even though it isn't actually designated in the plan as being a valued landscape. The other difficulty with designating valued landscapes is that it puts all those areas of the countryside which aren't valued landscapes under more pressure.
Yeah, okay.
And we've got a national park, it would be adding an additional tier of designations into the part of the district outside the national park,
So your framework,
which we don't think is necessary because
No,
we think
okay.
our countryside policies are doing the job.
okay, so, and when you talk about your countryside policies, any 1, any 9, rural character, any
Yes.
14?
Yes. I'm nodding.
So what you're saying to me is we haven't defined valued landscapes. We've got a policy framework that will give certainty about how such development that impacts would be assessed, and that would be
Indeed.
done on a case by case basis.
Yes, and I think the policy, I mean, you were commenting earlier about, you know, the degree of repetition and the detail that we go into. Current policy DM23, forgive me, I forget what it is now, is it 89? Rural character. Goes into some detail about visual intrusion, incongruity, impacts on the tranquility. We think the policy is quite robust.
So those are picked up in NE 14, NE 9, and then you've got one, is it NE 13, that deals with recreational developments.
Yeah,
So, yes,
which we
leisure
can
and
come on
recreation
to
in the
later, yes.
that picks up on this.
But
Okay.
particularly NE 14.
Yeah.
I think is the key policy.
That's the rural character one, isn't it?
It is, ma'am, yes.
Yes, and that picks up on the lighting and the noise, tranquility of the
Yeah,
lighting and the
we
noise,
think that is adequately
as does NE 13.
protecting the landscape of the district, which we acknowledge is of national importance. Part of it is designated as a national park, as you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mark, I mean, it goes back to your touchstones of effectiveness and soundness. And we've taken an approach not to adopt a concept which is frankly pretty vague. Courts have had several stabs at trying to define what valued landscapes are. The NPPF doesn't describe it. And of course, as Stuart's mentioned, the designation of some poses a risk to those which are not designated because an artificial distinction can be drawn. So in terms of looking at the effectiveness of the policy suite and its appropriateness, is it an appropriate strategy? We say clearly it is because it provides an effective framework for protecting and conserving landscape character.
Okay, I don't intend to rerun that argument when we get to the other policies, because it comes up, particularly NE9, and thank you very much for those contributions. Okay. So then you've got a number of MMs in relation to this policy. Would somebody like to introduce those?
Thank you, Ma'am. I'll introduce those. So as you know, we've got several for under proposed main modification 20 from in relation to proactive engagement with Historic England, Hampshire County Council and the Environment Agency. So there is first one modification in relation to Historic Environment Agency's Reg 19 response, and that's to encourage explicit acknowledgement that the natural and historic environment.
Sorry, can I just go back? This is in relation to criteria 4. And criteria 4 is dealing with development which would result in the loss and deterioration of irreplaceable habitats, including ancient woodland. Ancient veteran trees will only be permitted in exceptional zones while the public benefit clearly outweighs the loss or deterioration. Yeah. And you're suggesting an amendment to that?
Yes. So that's criteria 2 and 5. So that's in relation to the proposes a definition, proposes the policy NE1 to acknowledge the priorities of the Hampshire Local Nature Recovery Strategy, and the fact that it's currently in a drafting stage, and when it's at a point that it's finally published, the priorities will be recognised through the local plan.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going back to criteria 4. I've got an here. The local plan helps to ensure the landscape and natural environment of the district, which is valued so highly, is protected and enhanced. Where does that relate to?
Sorry, Mum, I'm just trying to locate that because it's not on our copy, so just bear with me a moment.
Are you looking at the very first entry and
yes.
the MM20? Yes, which says amend criteria 4 as follows.
So, okay, so that's in relation to 1, 3, 4, and it's in relation to the key issues.
Yes, I found that now. Thank you, Mum. Sorry, forgive me, I found it now.
Sorry, yeah. Okay.
So this is in relation to proactive engagement with Historic England in relation to their Reg 19 response, and it encourages explicit acknowledgement between the natural environment and historic environment and the fact that they're integral to each other. So we felt it was appropriate to include that within the policy to ensure that that acknowledgement was highlighted.
Okay. And you've already introduced the amendment to paragraph 7.23, which I understand. And then you've got some suggested amendments to criteria 2.
That's correct, Ma'am.
Puts a paragraph, the amendment to paragraph 7.23, it puts it in policy, doesn't it?
That's correct.
Okay, and then we move on to criteria 5.
So that's a additional proposed mod in relation to recognising the mitigation hierarchy approach of the NPPF, particularly paragraph 186A.
Yeah.
In relation to where compensation is made as a very last resort.
So that says off-site or a financial contribution in lieu of on-site mitigation will only be considered in limited circumstances where it's demonstrated the proposed mitigation is deliverable and effective. And then protects, conserves and enhances ecology and the air and water environments. Okay, so is there anything, could I turn to the table please? You've heard the matters that have been raised. Is there any things anyone wishes to say? CPRE Hampshire, please.
Thank you. I've heard indeed what they've said about valued landscape,
Yes.
which I might like to come
Yeah.
back to, please. Dealing first of all, looking at policy NE1, but I'll also encompass NE9, as you suggested you wouldn't be coming back to that.
I will come back to the policy, but not
Yeah.
this issue about valued landscapes.
No, so I'm dealing with that now.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I mean, we say it's quite rightly a key strategy of the plan that the natural environment and natural beauty of the plan area be protected and enhanced as appears in the vision. But looking at strategic policy NE1, it would not accord with national policy on the natural environment. A simple reference in it to including the natural beauty of the landscape within a policy for the protection of the natural environment as a whole, but amplified by policy wordings which deal almost entirely with biodiversity matters, would not provide the protection of valued landscapes or the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside, which the NPPF requires. I mean, in NE1, the only reference to landscape is the natural environment and biodiversity, including the natural beauty of the landscape. That's the only reference to it at all. And the rest is essentially, largely biodiversity, which is fine. I've got no objection to that. Now, I hear that the council says, well, the intention is for NE1 to be implemented as far as the natural beauty of the landscape is concerned, through policies NE9 on landscape and NE14 on rural character, but it doesn't actually say that. And even when taken together with NE9 and NE14, there is no policy to protect valued landscape or even mention a valued landscape. And of course, valued landscape encompasses the finest landscapes in the district, in the plan area. Now, we've heard the council's position, but maybe I can just try and summarise it so that we've got it clear and it can be checked with the council if so. The council's position, as we understand it, is that the NPPF allows for valued landscape to be designated in the local plan, but there is no requirement for the local planning authority to do so. Valued landscape, it is said, is not defined in the NPPF or PPG, and the landscape of the district will continue to enjoy a necessary degree of protection through policies NE9 and NE14. Further, while designation could offer a degree of additional protection to valued landscape, the lack of definition would mean, or lack of designation would mean testing through the appeal process, and the rest of the countryside would become more vulnerable to speculative development. That's how I understand the council's position. And our comments on that are that while we agree...
Sorry, yeah, okay, yeah.
I think we would agree with that, Mom. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Our comments are that while we agree that the NPPF does not require valued landscape to be designated, for example, on policy maps, it does require valued landscape to be protected and enhanced. So valued landscape does require additional protection in order for the plan to be consistent with national policy. Protection of other countryside is protected in the NPPF through the requirement to recognise the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside, and policies NE9 and NE14 set out to achieve that through protection of landscape character as described just now. But that is landscape character as defined in landscape character assessment and protection of the rural character of the area through NE14. But as I think we've already discussed to some extent, but while landscape character assessment is appropriate to identify the intrinsic character of the countryside, it is not an assessment of relative landscape value, as I think has been agreed, and will not identify any area as valued landscape. And accordingly, policy NE9, which is hinged around landscape character assessment, cannot bring into the planning process the additional protection for valued landscape required by the NPPF. which means that if valued landscape is not to be designated in the plan, it will be necessary for the council or developers to assess landscape on a case-by-case basis to establish whether or not a site is within a valued landscape, as indeed I think has been said. Especially where there is significant development proposed in areas likely to be valued landscape, which must include those areas identified as areas of special landscape quality in the 1999 local plan. Now, I accept there's quite a long time ago, but unless they've been degraded, there's still an assessment of the finest landscape in the district. And certainly whenever we look at this issue, we go back to those to see whether it's identified as area of special landscape quality on those plans. And when a site is thus assessed as within a valued landscape, it is difficult to see how it can be given the necessary additional protection without a specific policy designed to achieve that. Namely, a policy which sets out specific criteria for development in valued landscape to guide developers and case officers. We have suggested the text of such a policy in our hearing statement, based on that in the reviewed Hampshire Mineral and Waste Plan, which is no doubt supported by the council. But we would be quite content for that to be included in policy.
Sorry. I absolutely turned that off. I did, didn't I? I'm so sorry. Happens to us all. Absolutely is turned off. I'm so sorry. So sorry to interrupt
So I'm
you.
just saying we have provided a possible text for a policy,
Yeah,
which is
I've
based on the
seen
one in the Hampshire Mineral and Waste Plan. And we were quite content for that to be included in NE9 rather than NE1. I see that point. We still prefer NE1 to refer more specifically to landscape issues, but you know, that NE9 is dealing with landscape, although it's had its landscape character. We would prefer to be landscape, I think, in these contexts.
okay.
Just one more point.
Yeah, yeah.
As to lack of definition, there is clear guidance from courts' judgments and appeal cases as to what amounts to valued landscape, as we've indeed set out in our representation and hearing statement. Yes, there may be appeals when applications are refused on the basis of impact on valued landscape, but then that's true of many other policies. So we say failure to have a policy on valued landscape means that the plan is not consistent with national policy.
Okay, and you have seen NE1 refers to and enhance the natural environment and biodiversity, including natural beauty of the landscape.
It does refer to that.
Okay, so sorry, you do recognise that?
Yes, I think we're saying that that is there.
Yes.
But then the whole policy basically deals with biodiversity. So there isn't actually any more reference to landscape at all in NE1. It's just an incidental. However, having said that, I mean, you know, if we were to have a policy for valued landscape in NE9, then, you know, we wouldn't quibble too much about the reference in NE1.
Okay, thank you very much. Could I just pick up on one point? Obviously, you're familiar with the Minerals and Waste Plan. That does refer to valued landscapes. Could you just comment on that, please? That's part of the development plan.
Well, clearly, Mum, obviously, I've got the text here from CBRE. It does obviously mention it, but obviously that is the Minerals and Waste local plan. We're producing our own local plan on the advice of obviously our landscape officers and the approach that we've taken. Local authorities can take different views. That's our professional judgment.
Any contradiction?
I don't think so.
Any? Would that cause any problem?
No, I mean, the minerals and waste policy is directed, it seems, solely at valued landscapes. That rather gives me our point that by simply designating valued landscapes, there's a danger of degrading the protection offered to those landscapes which do not qualify for that definition of valued. say our approach is to extend the protection to all landscape in the district and subject it to individual assessment on a case by case basis.
Okay, are you able to comment on the points that have been put with regard to the inclusion of any pick up on any other points that have been put?
I'll start, Mum, and then I'll hand over to Mr.
I don't want to repeat anything that I've already asked.
No, that's fine. I was just going to mention about the reference to the protection of landscape and policy NE1. Although you've stated about the fact that the preamble to the policy mentions the natural beauty of the landscape. Well,
but it's in policy as well. Sorry, is it not in policy as well?
Yes, it's in the preamble to the policy, but
Okay.
also criteria 1 and 2 both say avoid significant harm to the natural environment and safeguards features of the natural environment. Well, that in fact includes landscape, so that would be incorporated within the policy.
Sorry, can you just refer me to that, please?
Yes, so criteria 1 states avoid significant harm to the natural environment in the first sentence.
Yes.
And then criteria 2 states safeguards features of the natural environment. So both of those would incorporate the natural beauty of the landscape and any landscape features. So it's the overarching, as we previously said, it's the overarching framework then for the landscape policy in NE9.
Okay, and as you've said, that it's in policy, but the first paragraph of that policy says it will protect and enhance the natural environment and biodiversity, including natural beauty of the landscape. And then you've got NE9 and NE14 below that. Sorry, Mr. Dunbar-Dempsey.
Well, Mum, I'm just agreeing with you.
Yeah.
Yes, that
Okay.
NE1 is quite clear, making that distinction between the natural environment and biodiversity and including the natural beauty of the landscape. And I think that is picking up on the CPRE's point that we're not just considering biodiversity, we are considering the natural beauty of the landscape as well in NE1, and then further on in NE9 and NE14. Yeah, and NE14.
Okay. Is there anything else anyone wishes to say on that matter?
Just make one.
CPRE?
What puzzles me a bit is I think the council says they've got to look at the countryside as a whole and they don't want to distinguish, if you like. But actually they've already said they will have to do a case by case study effectively to see, you know, what the value of the landscape is, which landscape character assessment won't provide. I think that's agreed. So, you know, the valued landscape will come out of that process anyway. But then you have to go to 180A, see that you have to give it additional protection. And we say that should be amplified by a policy in NE9, which sets out what the local plan policy on valued landscape is, in summary. It's just that they say they're going to have to do the work anyway. You know, so the final landscapes, quite rightly, will get more, well, should get more protection. But there will also be valued landscapes.
Okay. Okay, do you wish to respond on that?
I could have a go, Mum. The council disagrees, I think, with this because when we say on a case by case basis, we don't mean that we're going to start looking at every part of the district and decide whether or not it's valued or not. We're talking about when development proposals come in,
Yeah.
we assess the context of that development, and we can very quickly arrive at a judgment as to whether or not that context is sensitive by virtue of the criteria describing the value set out in the, sorry, I'm repeating myself a bit here, but we think we've got it pretty much
Okay.
sewn up, to be honest with you, Mum.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's move on. We'll come back to policy NE9 and NE14. Let's move on to NE2. This is a policy that focuses on promoting economic growth and job creation in the countryside and sets out mechanisms by which the plan can support this. Is that right? Why do you need this policy? What's the rationale for it? I know you've got large employers.
Thank you, Mum. I'll just explain the reasoning behind that. So, as you rightly state, it supports economic growth in the area, and it's considered to be an important policy as a district, as I say, is fortunate to have a number of key employers that make a valuable contribution to both the local and regional economies. I think also the policy demonstrates that the council has got a commitment to retaining those key employers, which are historically by their nature located within the countryside, hence the reason for the policy, but also recognises that their needs potentially would change over the plan period. Yeah. The policy is aimed at retaining and developing existing key employers, not vacant sites, and the council considers that this matter is adequately covered and refers to the reuse of existing buildings. I just wanted to say about policy criteria 2 as well. So the purpose of the policy is to support the preparation, that particular criteria of master plans to encourage landowners and businesses of both major commercial and educational establishments to plan in a comprehensive manner to maximise opportunities offered by the site and its existing structures prior to the need for additional development.
Yeah, okay, I get that. Criteria 2, worded a bit strangely. So the first one is the local planning authority will support the retention and development of existing major commercial, educational and MOD establishments. Okay, got that. Second one, any application for development is preceded by. Is that right? Should be preceded by? Any application for development should be preceded by and is consistent with a comprehensive and evidence-based site-wide master plan.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think it should be preceded by. The main thing is obviously these are usually complicated sites, you know, and that's why we want to basically know what's going to happen in the future.
If you look at that, please. Okay. Let's move on then. And we're moving on to...
Sorry, Mum, you got the council.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry, it's probably my fault. I put the card up and then took it down and should have put it up. I just wanted to pick up on...
Winchester Salt, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on the, before you moved on, the hearing statement matter 14, page 4, about ecosystem services, which I hoped you might have alighted on. I just wanted to...
Sorry, are you going back to...
I may be going back, I don't know. Yes, I am. But I think...
Sorry, which policy are you talking about?
Any one?
Yes, okay. Okay.
Sorry to go back, but I
no, okay.
Should have raised that.
I understand. So this was the point that you made about ecosystem services impact assessment.
Yes, and
whether they should come forward.
Yeah, and so I've read the council's statement on page 4, matter 14 hearing statement, but it's my contention, I think, for complete soundness or general completeness of the plan, given that 40% of the district lies within the South Downs National Park, In fact, the eastern side is 60% in the South Downs National Park, and 60% of all parish wards are in the South Downs National Park, that an ecosystem services approach would complete the soundness. And I note that while the draft local plan contains 17 policies relating to biodiversity and natural environment, an ecosystem service focus is weak. It's not mentioned in any one. It gets mentioned in para 7.22, and I believe that the limitations of biodiversity net gain and everything you've been talking about in terms of landscape, and given the crises in terms of nature and climate where we are, by having this, it aligns with SD2 policy of the South Downs, and actually it would pick up on what North Devon and Torridge local plan does. And I think that provides a more complete soundness approach. In other words, I'm asking for any development to assess and demonstrate how developments affect ecosystem services, which I think is all encompassing.
Okay. Does the council wish to respond to that?
Thanks, Mum. I think, yeah, we've picked up on a few points that we've sort of mentioned in our hearing statement anyway, but the council feels that we've addressed ecosystem services. We refer throughout the policies to ecosystem services in the supporting text, and we mentioned paragraph 7.22 and 7.31. Also in policy NE1 criteria 2, we make reference to nature-based solutions, and criteria 6, we mentioned protecting and conserving and enhancing ecology, air and water environments in the district. So we feel that covers it.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I don't need do you want to just...
Yeah, just very quickly, I accept that. I just think that the provisioning services, supporting services, the regulating services, cultural services, are what ecosystem services gives and underlines. If it's incorporated in a clear way by applicants in terms of when they make an application to assess and demonstrate how the development affects ecosystem services, you get a better rounded picture and understanding, given the need for sustainability, which is what is key as we move forward with lack of nature duties, weakened nature duties perhaps coming through in future legislation. This is really quite important.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I don't need any more help on that matter. I intend to move on now. Thank you. Let's move on to policy NE3. That policy deals policy seeks improvements in the open space network and inbuilt recreational facilities and allotments, and it sets standards for new development, open space standards, so that's quantity and access, and built facility standards, quantity, access by walking and driving. So can we just deal first of all with this policy is based on an open space assessment, and that assesses open space that we have at the moment. So please, who is that? Mr. Dunbar Dempsey. So of course, I mean, just that you set out the methodology, so that's a quantitative assessment, and then there is a qualitative element to that. So you look at the role, you look at why it's important, and indeed you look at accessibility. And what you've done is you use those to identify over provision or under provision on a parish basis. Is that right?
That's correct, Ma'am.
Okay, and then the policy goes on to seek to protect those, and indeed it underpins NE10 and other policies in the plan. So, I mean, this is a tricky one, but what the criticism that has been put to that is that, okay, that's based on existing needs. What are you doing about proposed needs? By all means, introduce other policies if you wish to, in responding to that.
Yeah, I think what we'd say is that the plain pitch strategy, which is at a draft stage at the moment, is providing that forward vision and pointing out that sort of explaining how need is growing, the demand for particularly sports provision is growing. The council is aware of that. Its open space assessment finds, I mean, the role of the open space assessment is to identify deficits by a ward or parish on a ward and parish basis. It finds that there are significant deficits in certain typologies. So for instance, in Winchester, we find there's an 18-hectare shortfall in sports provision. In looking forward, we feel that that assessment is informing planning policy in terms of the housing allocations. So, for example, several of the housing allocations make provision for open space to be provided as part of that housing allocation or linked to that housing development.
Okay, how is it looking into the future, that assessment, or is it? Is that if that assessment looks at the here and now, doesn't it? Is there anything that sets out a strategy that talks about what will happen in the future, or is that just done through other policies in the plan?
It is a snapshot, but it is also identifying deficits, and it is by its very nature looking into the future by saying we can't keep increasing house building without making corresponding provision, ensuring open space is keeping up with that projected housing increase. And again, I come back to the draft PPS, which is fulfilling that role of looking forward and identifying needs as opposed to setting standards. I think the council are trying to address what the NPPF is saying in, is it 103? 103, that the assessment should reflect quantitative and qualitative deficits, but also needs.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the draft PPS, we feel, has got that long-term vision in terms of what the needs are likely to be.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you've carried out an assessment that's identified deficits, oversupply. You've got those policies that protect and provide, and that's your strategy. Is that right? That's your strategy.
The strategy is both to protect what we have and to overcome deficits where we can.
Okay, I want to.
Sorry, Mum, just to add to that, I think it's really a combination of two policies within the natural environment and biodiversity chapter. So you've got NE3 that's looking at existing open space and trying to overcome the deficits and look at the surpluses identified by the open space assessment, 2022 open space assessment, but also policy NE11, which looks at the provision of new open space on developments over 10 units. So that in fact is trying to address any deficits that are recognised in the open space assessment going forward.
Yeah, so you've got the protection in NE10, you've got a new provision in NE11, and then you've got site allocations that will bring forward. No, I understand. I understand the strategy. Okay, thank you for that. And then you've got standards that are included in NE3. Could you just set out for me what the genesis of these standards are?
Yes, we can, Ma'am. So the council used to use a open space standards that were set out by the National Playing Fields Association, now known as the Fields and Trust, many years ago, and that was being used nationally, and there was a minimum standard, which at that time was 2.4 hectares or 6 acres.
Yeah.
Hence the 6 acre standard, which was widely taken up across the country. But then later the government said, no, we must get away from national standards and start, local authorities should start using drawing up their own locally derived standards. So this council undertook a study in 2008 with East Hampshire District Council, which recommended and justified new standards, new local standards, which embraced quality, accessibility, but particularly quantity, so that there was an increase on that 6 acre standard to almost 10 acres per 1,000 people in that standard. That standard was then subsequently reviewed as part of the preparation of the open space assessment in 2022, and was found to be still relevant. It was compared to neighbouring authorities and the open space standards that they had. And there was a similarity between them.
What's recent practice of them?
I'm sorry?
What's recent practice? What's recent practice told us?
I don't quite understand
Sorry,
your question.
what's the application of these standards? What has recent practice shown us?
Yes, what we have found is that open space provision generally is keeping up with the growth of housing. But in certain typologies, it's not keeping up. And I think where we're struggling, and I think this is coming up as a common theme, is with the larger typology. So parks, recreation grounds and sports grounds tend not to be keeping up quite as well. Having said that, in practice with our major development areas, so in this district we have 3 major development areas: Kings Barton, North Whiteley and west of Waterlooville. All of them are over providing according to our standard in terms of their sports provision. By North Whiteley by 18%, Kings Barton is over providing by 32%. So the council is working to try and overcome these deficits.
Okay, those standards, do they accord with Sport England standards?
No, because the Sport England standard makes reference to the national standard. Our standard, as we've explained, is a locally derived standard. It is seeking to cover all the open space typologies, not just the sports needs. The Sport Winchester, the Sport England assessment would have, because it is such a high standard, would mean that Winchester actually has a 30 hectare deficit in sports provision. I think we're all actually we've all got the same objective. We're trying to ensure sports provision keeps up with population growth, and there are deficits. And it seems that only through these major development areas that we can actually begin to really tackle those deficits.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on to Para 1 03, and you've referred to that previously. So that deals with the protection of open space, sports and necessary buildings at land. It includes playing fields. So explain how the policy NE3 would be furthering those aims, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. So the council considers that policy NE3 is consistent with paragraph 103. It furthers the aims by bullet points criteria I of the policy text accords with criteria B of paragraph 103 of the NPPF, in stating that alternative facilities will be at least equivalent in size and quality. In relation to criterion 2 and 3 of the policy, this accords with criteria A of the NPPF by demonstrating that the facility is no longer required for its purpose or alternative facility and clearly outweighs the loss of the current facility.
Okay, so this is, as we've said, a suite of policies. So we've got NE10 and we've got NE11, and we've already spoken about that. NE10 is protecting open spaces, and NE11 is providing is about the provision of new open space in new developments. Okay, so can you just expand on how those complement each other, or is there any contradiction between them? So one, for want of a better word, is probably setting out the context for the others.
Yes, we've got it written down somewhere. I'm just trying to find it. Emma might be able to assist me.
Thank you, Ma'am. I'll just expand on that point. So in relation to the interaction between NE10, NE3 and NE11, so NE10's been carried forward from the adopted local plan, which was previously DM5, and extends the scope of paragraph 103 of the NPPF, which purely focuses on the recreational value of open space within settlement boundaries, where there's a general presumption in favour of development, and therefore NE10 is necessary to identify and protect important open areas within settlement boundaries. It also provides a clear purpose by providing protection for spaces identified as having important amenity, biodiversity, heritage or recreational value. Taken together with NE3 and NE11, the council considers that policies provide a good level of protection for valuable open space and provide a balance between recreational needs and the consideration of wider community benefits. It's not considered that there's an inconsistency between those policies. As we set out, NE3 sets out the standards sought in regards to various categories of open space, as we've set out the existing sort of deficits and shortfalls, but policy NE11 provides details of how this will be implemented in respect of new developments.
Okay. Okay, I understand what you've said on that. I'm going to go on after this to consider NE10 and NE11, but let me just stop there. Does anybody wish to come into this discussion on NE3? I want to concentrate just on NE3 at the moment. Sport Winchester.
I don't know where to start. My brain is a bit fried listening to all these numbers, but
you don't have to repeat anything that you said in our previous session, because that's all in my mind.
That's fine. I think the to try and build off, I think we all recognise there's a shortfall. You know, that's acknowledged generally. The open spaces report, the new playing pit strategy recognised the shortfall. I think there needs to be better application of standards into delivery. So whether it was in 2008, whether it was in 2022, the actual delivery of facilities, for want of a better word, or open spaces falls behind what is required. So there is a gap in the policy
or the approach or the whatever it is you're wrapping around this, the seriousness, the weight that you put behind this within the plan, because it's not coming forwards in terms of delivering stuff, outcomes. So there is a gap in the delivery of the strategy, whether that's in the wording, the sentiment is strong, but the seriousness with which the plan deals with this issue, but just the fact that it's a serious issue for the people of the city.
Okay, are you talking about the application of existing policy?
Yeah, it's just the fact that it's a shortfall is identified and that shortfall is not then rectified, and that's been going on for a long time. And in addition, there is a future demand that is coming down the track, and that shortfall is not really being seriously addressed. So I said so that's probably echoing the point that I made before.
Yeah.
The second point, which I think is pertinent, is because of the nature of the language that is used, because it's called an open space report, the breadth of the report encompasses both open space facilities and more formal settings, sports clubs and things like that. We think that there's huge benefit in adding more clarity to the discussion by separating those out. So in the policy maps and having clarification. So when you talk about development areas having allocation of 30% open space, that might be true as open space, but it doesn't address any of the formal sports facility requirement of which there is a shortfall. And because there is a confusion of language and there's not clarity of those things, we've found it really hard to understand the difference between these two, these areas. What we're not saying is don't have open space or don't have any of these things. They're all equally important. But because there is an obfuscation often in definition, and it doesn't come through in the policy maps, it's very difficult to see. Sometimes spaces are classified open space and formal sports facility at the same time. So you end up with a lack of clarity as exactly what you're talking about. You're comparing apples with.
Okay, Mr. Raymond, are you looking at policy NE3 and the standards?
Yes.
Just so there that clearly indicate what the standard is for different types.
Yes.
Of sport facilities, and you're saying that isn't clear.
It is. It is crystal clear when you do the analysis. Say there is a shortfall.
Yeah.
And then the argument put forward around how that shortfall is being addressed is often, for example, let's give you an example. If there is a 20 hectare shortfall and that 20 hectare shortfall is in formal sports space, not informal open space, that is a shortfall of built environment effectively. The argument put forward in policy documents often is, well, we've allocated 30 hectares of space around this development, but because it is just open space, it is not formal sports facilities. These two things don't match, so we end up with a confusion. And
okay. But is that it? So you're talking about the application of policy?
Yes, application.
You're talking about the
definition of terms and standards.
Okay.
Sorry, that's probably not being articulating very clearly.
Okay. I understand the point being made. Do you wish to comment on that, Mr. Dunbar Dempsey?
Yes, we would like to comment. Thank you, Ma'am, on that. No, I do understand the comments being made, but the council would not agree with this. We specifically, by using the open space assessment, that will tell us, let's take Wickham, for example, that will tell us what the deficits in Wickham are. And it won't just say open space, it'll actually distinguish what the specific deficits are, including sports grounds. That finding will translate into the drafting of the local plan allocations policy. So it will say, Mr. Developer, if you want to build 500 houses in Wickham, you will need to make some provision for sports. So in Wickham, both the Wickham allocations have both made provision for sports by means of financial contributions. So the Persimmon scheme in Wickham has provided £160,000 towards the replacement of the sport pavilion on the recreation ground. The London Road Bewley scheme has provided a sum, I forget exactly what it is, a sizable sum to implement new sports grounds on Mill Lane in Wickham. Because the open space assessment found there to be that deficit, it is translated into the allocated, the specifics of the allocation. So
no, okay, so what
we
you're
think
saying
we've got
is
it.
that, yeah, what you're saying is that the open space assessment is translated into
Is
the site
informing
allocation.
the
Okay.
allocations.
If you wish to have any more information on that, can I suggest that this conversation takes place outside the examination room? I just want to move on to deal with you've suggested some main modifications to NE3. Could I just ask you to introduce those, please, and the reasons for them? So the first one is all included in suggested MM21, paragraph 7.28 is the first one.
Thank you, Mum. So that's in relation to provide further clarity in the sporting text as to how the loss of open space would be evidenced and justified by applicants. So the additional text is, in such circumstances, any proposal should be accompanied by a detailed assessment which clearly demonstrates that the loss of that open space would not be detrimental and the benefits are clearly outlined. And then the second modification is to paragraph 7.29.
Yeah.
And that provides additional supporting text to acknowledge in relation to working with partner organisations to provide strategic open space, such as suitable alternative natural green space, which also links with the provision of GI as stated in policy NE4.
Yeah. Okay, and then you've got amendments to table 2.
That's
with regard to sports hall.
That's correct. That's to correct an error in the table. So that's the standards that should be applied rather than.
Okay, so this is an error.
Yes, that's right.
Sorry, I'm just all in relation to sports hall. Oh yeah, okay, I've got that. Okay, thank you. Could we move on to the related policies, NE10, NE11, and we've touched on these. So the first one is, and this is again the strategy that we were speaking about. This is about NE10 seeks to protect open spaces within settlement boundaries with important amenity, biodiversity, heritage, recreational value. Now, this is just within settlement boundaries, and that's presumably because those are the ones that are under threat. Yeah.
That's correct, Mom.
And this again is based on the methodology that we've spoken about. You've justified why the policy only relates to within settlement boundaries, and you've explained to me how it furthers the aims of 103. We've already spoken of that, about that, haven't we?
Correct.
And it's based on the open space assessment. Yeah, I've got all of that. In terms of local green spaces, now you don't allocate any. It is in the NPPF, paragraph 100 and something, can't remember. You say that those are better designated through neighbourhood plans, don't you? They can only be designated in a review of a plan, can't they? Could you just explain that point, please, and why that's the most effective? I don't feel as if I can comment on that, quite frankly. Is it Mr. Dempsey, Mr. Dunbar Dempsey,
It'll be my colleague dealing with this.
please?
Thank you, Ma'am. So I think the first point really is that national policy makes clear that a blanket designation of all green spaces is not appropriate.
Absolutely.
The neighbourhood plan would be able to identify local green spaces that are demonstrably special to the local community, and it's considered that it's appropriate that it's dealt with as part of this process. In terms of, I understand
the neighbourhood planning process.
That's right. I understand that we have had some representations in
Yeah.
relation to not designating local green spaces as part of the plan, but in fact, communities were consulted as part of this on the production of the 2022 open space assessment, and that was incorporated as part of the open space assessment. And also in terms of the neighbourhood planning process, we've got 5 neighbourhood plans that are being prepared at the moment, and New Alresford Town Council in fact are in the process of identifying local green spaces in their neighbourhood plan. So we feel that it's more appropriate for it to be any local green spaces to be designated through that process.
Okay. Does it go to the heart of soundness, this matter? Sorry. No, okay.
Applying what we've said before.
Okay. And you've suggested some amendments to that policy. Could we just look at that? That's NE 10. This is in relation to playing fields, isn't it? So you do mention playing fields.
That's right, Ma'am. Shall I expand on that
please.
Proposed modification? So there's a new paragraph to be inserted after the current 7.82 and the supporting text. So this is a response to Hampshire County Council and their Reg 19 consultation, which highlighted that the plan should recognise the ability for school playing fields to be disposed of for alternative uses, to secure funding for recreational and educational improvements, or used to accommodate school expansions by virtue of Section 77 of the School Standards and Framework Act, and supported by paragraph 99 of the NPPF. Proposals for loss of school playing fields are sent to the Secretary of State for consent and are determined on the overall balance of benefit of the disposal against expected gains to pupils and existing community users. In order to be consistent with national policy and legislation, the mod has been proposed as an exception.
Okay, I don't have any further queries on that. I don't have any further queries on that policy. Anything else anyone wishes to say on that policy? Okay, let's move on to NE 11, and this is the associated policy that deals with open space provision in new development. Now, just a query on this one. So you've got residential development of 10 dwellings and above. And your, sorry, I want to make sure that I'm clear on this. Your standards are set out in NE 3 relate to those. What about sites below 10 dwellings? You've got criteria there that says what you say is all sites below 10 dwellings and other forms of development, blah de blah, should provide adequate amenity space. And then you've got a criteria-based policy that says of high standards, maintaining and enhancing visual and environmental character, incorporating hard landscaping and planting, and future management.
Yes, thank you, Ma'am. Yeah, we think that that policy covers those eventualities where the housing developments are slightly smaller
by obligating the developer to provide adequate amenity space, and that's something that we feel is a judgment that needs to be made on a case-by-case basis. It's often not practical or feasible to provide actual recreational space on a smaller housing development, but that shouldn't mean that there is a lack of green infrastructure of some sort on the site.
But without any standard at all, would that policy be effective? There's nothing there. I mean, as you say, it's a judgment call on a case-by-case basis, isn't it? There's no standard at all or no standards for even gardens or that sort of thing. Is this the genesis of this an existing policy? What's recent practice been?
What we might say is that this does link to the requirement for green and blue infrastructure. So coming back to the plan, that must be read as a whole.
Okay, so that's NE4, isn't it?
NE4 lists a number of factors to be considered, even on a small housing development. Should be protecting as a first principle any existing GI, but also looking to provide additional GI on the site.
Sorry,
So
where are you referring? Yeah,
so
I'm in NE4.
NE4. So must provides a measurable net gain of well-managed multifunctional green infrastructure. Incorporates landscaping schemes with natural planting of at least 50% pollinator-friendly species. We feel these are quite detailed.
It is, but
Yeah.
in terms of the size, in terms of the quantitative measure of size, is that policy going to be effective without anything that tells them, well, and as you say, it's a judgment call on provision of adequate amenity space?
We acknowledge that it doesn't actually specify sizes when you get down to that size of housing development, but we still think that the policy is doing its job and achieving a satisfactory type of provision.
I mean, it's really a function of the size of site and the size of provision. The smaller you get, obviously, the harder it gets to provide an objective, quantified standard. And this is something that would be part of the ordinary development control processes, pre-application discussions.
But very often you set standards for the size of gardens and private amenity space, don't you?
Yes, but as I say, this is for this particular type of provision, we say it's an appropriate way of dealing with that kind of size of approach.
Hear what you say. Is there anything else that you'd like to say on that? And of course, that requires open space provision in other types of developments as well, doesn't it? So
it does, ma'am. Yes, care homes, that sort of thing.
Okay, I get that. Okay, would anybody else like to say anything on that point? Okay, any suggested main modifications to that policy? That's and 11. I don't have any. No. Okay. Okay, let's take a break now. It's now 25 to. Let's come back at 10 to 12. Thank you very much. It's now 10 to 12 and this session is now resumed. I want to move on to changing the way we're dealing with things a little bit. I want to move on now to deal with NE9 and any NE9 and NE14 because we've already touched on those. I then want to move on very quickly to NE8 And then we'll deal with equestrian development and leisure and recreation in the countryside. So that's NE 12 and NE 13. Because I want to deal with those policies really quite quickly. I don't have a great deal of issue with those. So NE 9. So again, this is about landscape character. Does that, I understand, my question there, I understand, I don't need any more help on this. Is there anything else that the council would like to say, please? No, okay. Any suggested main modifications? I don't think there is. I don't think there is. Let's move on to NE 14, which again we've touched on, and this is dealing with the rural character. And we've spoken about it. It sets out what should be the considerations outside defined settlement boundaries in relation to impact on the rural character of the area. Is there anything that the council wish to pick up on with that?
I don't think so, Ma'am. I think the main point is that the policy, although it's in the extant local plan, it's being reviewed, and to date we've not really encountered any difficulties with its implementation. And as we've cited in our response, the AMR highlights that the policy is still successful in its application, with 32% of applications refused over the previous authority monitoring report year. So it still serves a clear purpose in its approach.
Okay, so I've raised the issue of the relationship in that policy. You refer to, for example, the impact resulting from the volume and type of traffic generated by development will be assessed along with the ability of rural roads to accept increased levels of traffic without alterations that would harm their rural character. How does that relate to your transport policies?
So yeah, so paragraph 7.105 of the supporting text specifically references traffic generation.
Yeah.
And paragraph 7106 sets out the context for extensions and ancillary buildings. I know you also reference D1 as well in your
well, D1 and
H8
the domestic extensions. That's H8, is it?
That's right.
Yeah.
So we consider that all of these factors align with the principles set out in policies T1, H8, and D1.
Okay, it's the same. I hear what you say, but clearly those matters are dealt with elsewhere. Public rights of way. When we're doing development should not detract from the enjoyment of the countryside from the public realm or public rights of way. Is that clear? Mr. Dunbar Dempsey.
Thank you, Mum. Yeah, we think it's clear because people using public rights of way tend to be the enjoyment of the countryside is very much foremost in their minds when they're using public rights of way, and they're considered in the guidelines for landscape and visual impact assessment to be the most sensitive receptors. Yeah. So I think that's why reference is made to public rights of way.
Yeah, I get that. What about in relation to T1? Would there be any conflict at all with T1 and the aims of T1? Would it preclude the impact resulting from the volume and type of traffic generated by the development will be assessed along with the ability of rural roads to accept increased level of traffic without alterations that would harm rural character? So what you'll say is that that is another arm effectively to T1. Is that right?
I think that's correct. Obviously, the policy we're looking at is talking about rural character.
Yeah.
And obviously the district has got a high presence of obviously rural kind of lanes, etc. So that's why kind of that's pulled out as a distinct area that is important to obviously the character district. Whereas I see T1 is more of a general policy in terms of where we're going.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll take a view on that. Anything else anyone would like to say on this policy? Okay. We'll move on. From that, South Downs National Park, I don't have much to say on that. You suggested an MM, and that MM eight, isn't it? Yes, it is. South Downs National Park, and basically what the policy aims to do, and you've confirmed, is to control development within the setting of the national park. The National Park Authority gave comments on that, and you've suggested an MM to address that. Is that the nub of it?
That's correct, Ma'am. Yes, I think where we've got comments from the South Downs National Park and there's been amendments by Section 245 of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Acts, it requires all relevant bodies, including Winchester City Council, to seek to further the purposes of the South Downs National Park. So that's to ensure that the policy is in accordance with the relevant changes to the legislation and also to strengthen the wording in line with para 182 of the NPPF.
Yeah, and we've spoken about that, haven't we?
Yeah.
Requirements for policy making, the requirements.
Just to state as well, there's a slight amendment in the addendum I want to say to the that accompanies the schedule of proposed modifications. It's been slightly revised with the agreements of the South Downs National Park to ensure it meets the wording of the Section 245 of the LURA.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I don't have any further questions on that. Does anybody else? Okay, let's move on then. And I'd like to move on to those policies. The first one, NE12, dealing with equestrian development. And then we'll deal with NE13. So equestrian development is it's not dealt with which of the housing policies, H11, isn't it? H11 specifically doesn't deal with equestrian development, does it?
That's correct.
And this policy deals with all horse related facilities. And what you say to me is that you've had a history of, and you quantify that the type of developments that you've received, and that justifies inclusion of this policy. Okay, I get all of that. Let's move on to the criteria, and you've got, I raised the issue of two criteria in particular, that's 5 and 8. Could you justify those, please?
Yes, thank you, Ma'am. I'll start and then Mr. Dunbar Dempsey may wish to step in. So criterion 5 calls for professional judgment as to whether the listed elements would have an adverse impact on the appearance of the landscape or not. So there are many cases where these elements do not have an adverse impact, but the LPA at the end of the day needs to be able to make a judgment about this, hence why the criteria remains. In relation to criterion 3, including a satisfactory landscaping scheme, there could be equestrian proposals in both heavily enclosed landscapes and conversely so in very visual open situations, and sometimes there will be well-used public footpaths within view. Sometimes the context is seen to be more sensitive, i.e. in close proximity to the national park or recognised viewpoints. Landscape schemes are frequently deemed to be needed where visual intrusion has been identified as an issue, either from well-used lanes or more sensitive public rights of way. Obviously, one expects to see equestrian development in the countryside, but occasionally it can appear invasive because of its size, and therefore it might need mitigating, hence the inclusion.
Do you need any flexibility though? Because you can think of many circumstances where satisfactory satisfactory landscaping screen wouldn't be required.
I think it's to be judged on a case-by-case basis.
But the policy doesn't say that, does it? It says will be permitted where a countryside location is necessary, provided they comply with other policies in the development plan, and so it doesn't introduce any flexibility there, does it? Same thing. Sorry, I can leave that with you. Same thing with 5. I mean, sorry, what is use of construction materials? I wasn't clear what that meant.
So, Ma'am, for example, the surfacing on access tracks can have a significant effect on the character of the area. Okay. So,
is that a well-known term, construction materials? Am I missing something? It means bricks and hardcore and that sort of thing, does it?
I mean, maybe the word construction is superfluous because materials would be.
Use of materials. I'll leave that with you. I'll leave that with you, please.
Perhaps also just flag up that we'll also think about the word adverse impact, whether that needs to be have the word unacceptable, some such other language.
Where are you, please?
Criterion 5, Ma'am.
Do not involve the use of citing new or other infrastructure related to the question that would have an adverse impact. And I'm sorry, what's the point you're making?
The point is that on reflection, that might be restrictive, very restrictive, because on its face, any adverse impact would found a refusal, and obviously that may not be what's actually intended. So I think we'll probably come back to that with
the
introduction of something that the word's unacceptable or
and could I ask again, that you look at those criteria and see should there, because it's quite clear what the requirements of the policy is, whether more flexibility should be introduced, particularly on 5 and 8.
Yes, no, we take that away. Thank you.
Okay, I don't need an answer to that now. Does anybody wish to make a comment on that? Okay, let's move on. So the related policy is NE 13. That deals with leisure and recreation in the countryside. So it sets out criteria against which development facilities or expansions will be assessed, and it speaks about the same things as you talk about in terms of rural character, noise, visual intrusion, ecological impacts. It again speaks about lighting and landscaping controls that are again in NE 9 and 14. So how would it relate to SP3 and in particular SP32? Would it be more restrictive than SP32? And that says development which has an operational need for a countryside location such as agriculture, horticulture, forestry or outdoor recreation. And this says the development of new leisure and recreational facilities for which countryside location is necessary. The expansion of established facilities and the use of land for leisure and recreational activities will be permitted.
Thank you, Mum. So in terms of the interaction between policy NE13 and strategic policy SP3. So policy SP3 provides the overarching framework for the following types of development that would be permitted in the countryside.
Okay, and that does say development which has an operational need for a countryside location,
That's right,
doesn't it? Okay.
It's not considered necessary, or the council do not consider it necessary for policy SP3 to expand on the broader leisure and recreational uses that would be permitted, as this is provided in the supporting text to policy NE13. And as we have said before, the plan should be read as a whole. It's considered that with those two policies taken together, a suitable range of leisure and recreational facilities should can be provided within the countryside.
Okay, so you're recognising that SP3 is more restrictive, but this gives particular detail on leisure and recreation activities, and you say the outside defined settlement boundaries, so new leisure and recreational facilities and expansion of existing facilities.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, does anybody wish to speak about that?
Thank you, Ryan.
Turleys?
Ryan Johnson on behalf of Three Maids Property. Our client is seeking a minor modification to remove any perceived interpretive conflict between these two policies over what is covered under criterion 2 of the policy in particular. And this is SP3 criterion 2.
Yep.
By one interpretation, I could assume the reference to such as means what follows is not an exhaustive list, and hence there's no need to add any changes to the policy.
Sorry, where are you there?
SP3 criteria 2.
Yes.
Halfway down it says such as. So I take from that what follows is potentially not an exhaustive list.
Okay.
And, as has just been heard, you should read the plan as a whole. However, policy NE13 appears to encompass, as we've just heard, slightly more than perhaps inferred in SP3, referring to a much wider range of leisure and recreational uses, as opposed to just outdoor recreation. And I could possibly argue it both ways, which implies the policy is generating unnecessary interpretation and hence not effective, and hence why I suspect you've got it on the agenda. I know elsewhere in policy SP3, the council make references to other housing policies. So in criteria 6 and criteria 7, for precision and avoidance of ambiguity, the council reference housing policies. Our client therefore suggests a relatively minor amendment to the policy to be consistent with that. So we're suggesting in policy SP3 part 2, we remove the words outdoor recreation and replace it with leisure and recreation, comma, in line with policy NE13. And then that reduces the need to interpret the two policies side by side and ensures policy SP3 is effective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, you've heard what's been said. We've already spoken about other references and cross-referencing in the plan. I don't need any help on that, but would it provide clarity I mean, that isn't that seems to me such as isn't an exhaustive list. Could I have a comment from the council, please?
I have to say, I'm not sure we see really the issue here. I mean, it's 798 has again another non-exclusive list of kind of recreation. Sorry, 7.98 talks about
As a list.
examples of.
Yeah.
Although there's a difference of wording, I don't think there's a difference of concept between the concept of,
and again, they're examples,
operational need for a countryside location as opposed to countryside location is necessary. I mean, they're different words, but the same concept, I think. So I'm not sure that we see that there is any difficulty of interpretation or application.
And sorry, what were you suggesting? The use of forestry or leisure recreation?
No, just replace the words outdoor recreation in sub-criteria 2 of SP3 with the words leisure and recreation.
Leisure and recreation.
In line with policy NE 13.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a precision point. What you don't want is members of the public or others having to flick back and forth between the policies. It's very explicit. And as I say, when I read this first, I equally looked at the words such as it's not an exhaustive list. But then I went back and forward between the two policies and I thought, if I'm doing that, others will do that. And it's a simple fix, which is why I think the council have referenced the H policies in SP3 as well for the same reason. So I'll leave it with you.
Oh, you have actually referred to other policies.
Yes, I mean, we don't die in a ditch on this, to be honest.
No,
It's a matter for you to consider. Mark.
Okay. I'll give that some consideration. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. Is there anything else that anyone wishes to raise on NE 13? Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on to NE 7. This policy deals with settlement gaps. And what the policy does, it aims to retain the generally open and undeveloped natures of defined settlement gaps. And you've got a number of them there. They're listed in 7.63 and they're again listed in the policy itself. So what it says that within those areas, any development should not undermine the function of the gap and its intended role to define and retain, and it gives the function of the gaps there to define and retain the separate identity of settlements. Yeah, so that's very clear there. Any development should not threaten the generally open and undeveloped nature of the gap and avoid coalescence. So first of all, can we just go back to bases? Why is this policy necessary, please?
Thank you, Ma'am. So the primary purpose of the settlement gaps is to prevent the coalescence of settlements and maintain the integrity and identity of settlements and provide a sense of place and protect the function of gaps. Obviously it's been gaps policies have been provided for a number of years. And we've got a list of gaps within the district itself, which have obviously been reviewed through the settlement gap review, and we still feel that these are relevant in applying the policy and within the methodology.
Okay, so there's nothing in national policy that says about this, but the genesis of it is from the work done, the strategic work done.
That's right, and also through the work from the Partnership for South Hampshire through their framework.
That's right, and indeed they have guidance. I'm just so that we don't spend unnecessary time on it. I understand that there's guidance for the identification of strategic gaps, and that's exactly what you've done. So what you've done in this plan, and it's very clear that those aren't a countryside designation or a landscape policy, and we're all in agreement on that. It's about ensuring that the identity, as you say, that settlements don't coalesce and their identity is retained. Okay, understand that. So that's based on an assessment. So you've touched on it. You've carried out a review, the assessment, and that was done by Luck, and that was based on a methodology. You don't go into the details of that methodology. Could you just tell us about that methodology, the methodology that was used, please?
Yes, ma'am. So the review of the settlement gaps applies a thorough and robust methodology that was used to review the policy on settlement gaps in the Reg 18 local plan in order to inform policy NE7 that protects settlement gaps. The methodology was used in the study that was based on the consultant's comprehensive experience of completing a number of similar studies and recent appeal decisions. The methodology for the review assessed the strength of each gap, taking into consideration its contribution to the setting of the settlement, the degree of physical and visual separation it provides, and the extent of urbanising influences. It also considered several factors key to preserving settlement separation. The existing designated settlement gaps were then reviewed and assessed. As you've quite rightly stated, there's no national methodology for creating settlement gaps, and there's no prescribed minimum width extent that a gap should include. The review recognises that the existing settlement gaps still perform their function to which they originally sought to protect and ensure settlement identity, and therefore have been retained.
So what's been put to me is actually that study didn't confine itself to the purposes of the gaps, and we've set out what the purpose of the gaps is. Actually, it went on to assess other things. Could you just respond to that point?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful as well just to kind of point out how the gap review followed the 2008 framework in terms of looking at the function of the gaps. So the methodology followed the 2008 PUSH framework by providing analysis that identifies how land contributes to settlements in terms of the criteria identified in the 2008 guidance, i.e. the sense of separation between settlements.
Sorry, what are you referring to there?
Sorry, the 2008 PUSH framework guidance.
Sorry, could you start again on that? The PUSH framework guidance, yeah?
So the gap review follows the 2008 PUSH framework guidance in terms of the criteria identified.
Clearly sets out that there's spatial planning.
That's right, and the criteria listed have then been used to review and reassess the gaps in the district, as stated in paragraph 3.2 of the gap review. And the methodology is followed for each gap in Appendix A of the review, noting that the 2008 policy is not entirely prohibitive of development. It does not try to define a minimum gap, but identifies key factors contributing to the gap purposes.
and sorry, those key factors are those that are in the push framework guidance.
That's right.
That's what you're saying. Okay, I understand.
And
Carry
this
on.
is in order to help inform judgments as to whether development in any particular location would have a significant impact in this regard. It suggests locations not currently in gaps would make a significant contribution if included, and locations that are in gaps which don't contribute much. But the City Council believes that the principle of defining settlement gaps remains a valid and robust way for maintaining settlements, and the methodology is appropriate and robust.
Okay, so what you're saying, sorry, please correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is that you took into account the purposes, you assessed against purposes, but you used those criteria in order to assess those purposes. You use the criteria in the push guidance, the 2008 guidance.
That's correct.
Okay, I understand that. Now, what, I mean, you refer to Luck and Luck's methodology. Did that include, was that desk-based, or did it include on-site judgment, etc.?
So in terms of the actual work that was carried out by LUC, this is a desk-based study. However, as I've pointed out, that LUC have quite a range of experience in assessing settlement gaps, and they've carried out a number of strategic settlement gap assessments for local authorities, which set out similar methodologies. And I just like to point out that the tendering district local plan and beyond section 2, which was adopted in 2021, the inspector in their report, paragraph 131, stated that the strategic green gaps review provided a robust assessment of the existing gaps, and along with the evidence submitted by the council to the examination, provides a comprehensive analysis of reasons for their retention.
Okay, so what are you saying to me? You're saying that that was a desk-based study. It didn't include on-site assessments or visits, etc. What are you saying about that?
That is correct, but obviously I was integral in that study, as Mr. Stuart Dunbar-Smith was actually involved with the study as well. So we've obviously got the local knowledge because obviously we know the district, and also obviously the tools that are available now, basically in terms of GIS, Street View, etc., are very, very comprehensive in terms of basically what they're. But our local knowledge brought that extra kind of rigour to the assessment to basically sense check and challenge, and we did challenge LUC on their findings. So I think that basically brought down to a local level in terms of what actually happened.
So it was subject to officer review.
Internal officer review. Like I say, we worked very closely once we'd got their initial draft and recommendations. And like I say, my colleague Stuart obviously knows the district a lot better than I do in terms of basically going out and about and knowing basically these gaps inside out.
Okay, so what you say is it was robust and proportionate. I understand your position. Others around the table have a different position. Okay, so that study, you've got 9 gaps. That study assessed 7. You didn't assess 2, and that relates to the Winchester Littleton and the Wellbourne. Now, let's deal with the Wellbourne one first. What you say is that that's already established. It's in the Wellbourne plan. Could you just could you just tell me why you didn't assess?
I think, if I may, obviously we were trying to be proportionate in terms of the work. The Wellbourne obviously kind of has obviously planning permission, obviously through Fareham, and obviously we are implementing that obviously gap through our work. So it was just basically, we looked at it and we discussed it internally, and we discussed it with LUC as part of the tendering process, and it just wasn't proportionate to actually look at it because it basically it was part of a planning permission, which basically obviously is being implemented at the moment. So it just basically proportionally, we just took the view that there was no
And does that
purpose.
planning permission identify?
It does, yeah. Well, obviously it straddles.
Yeah,
It straddles. Obviously, that bit straddles our area, etc. But obviously, the Wellbourne plan does include the gap, and obviously, it was part of the cross-boundary agreement.
Okay, and some around the table say that it doesn't actually, because you've just got those small buffers.
Yeah.
And what can you explain that, please?
I think obviously it's a roll forward, obviously gap from the existing adopted plan, which obviously was basically found sound. And obviously we would disagree with that assertion that obviously it mirrors obviously what the permission obviously is, and obviously what the cross-party agreement was at that time.
Sorry, and to my question there that, you know, some around the table say, well, the Wellbourne plan doesn't identify that gap. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that comes down to obviously because obviously the Wellbourne is in Fareham, but obviously the Wellbourne plan, and obviously it's just basically it's an outcome of that work that obviously the gap ended up in our district, and for a particular reason, basically to stop that coalescence. So we feel it is consistent. We certainly haven't got an objection from Fareham Borough Council on it, who obviously were the determining authority.
Okay, let's deal with the Winchester Littleton gap, and you know what you say is that there's ongoing work on Sir John Moore's barracks. We've seen the master plan, we've spoken about the master plan in some detail, and what you're saying is that that will define the edges of the gap. That's not the way that it's been done with the other gaps, is it? That's so it hasn't been reviewed. Could you? What's your position there? Please?
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, I think we discussed it at the Winchester obviously hearings, obviously where we talked about Sir John Moore Barracks, but obviously it is quite a unique situation, the Littleton and Winchester gap, because obviously there is existing built development within the gap. And I think that's the key distinction, that obviously there is existing building. Our approach, our professional approach that we've taken is within this local plan, basically the gap will remain as it is. So in other words, obviously the settlement gap that's there will remain, and that's on the policies map. Now, obviously the concept master plan has gone some way to obviously define the scope and the extent of the proposed development. And obviously that's been subject to public consultation, which was discussed, etc. But obviously that work is still ongoing in terms of where exactly that development will be. So we took a decision that obviously it would be premature to basically define that gap, because that work we knew was going on. And obviously, given the unique situation where there is already existing built development within the gap, there may well be opportunities as part of that work to extend the gap. And I think there are examples where we could extend that gap basically once we know where the development's going to go. And I think basically that's the best way to deal with it. Now, I appreciate that's not the way we've approached other settlement gaps, but this is a unique situation that we're in terms of basically the unique characteristics of the site and the fact that obviously there is built development in this gap.
Okay, I understand. And that's your justification for the non-application, the non-consistency. Inconsistency.
But I think obviously what I will say is obviously in a way, leaving the gap as it is, the bar is quite high in terms of basic, because obviously the policy would apply. So an application came forward would have to actually demonstrate obviously why development was there. And that's part of the justification which would need to come forward with the application. So in fact, there's a kind of bigger safeguard, isn't there? Because basically the policy applies to everything that's there. So we would expect obviously a planning application to justify that.
Okay, and then the last point I want to raise is the timing. And obviously we've heard about the housing need, we've heard about the unmet need. This review came forward. Did it take into account and look at the review? Did it review those gaps in light of the strategic need? Should it have done?
Sorry, can you clarify that exactly what you mean?
The timing with which this review took place, obviously meant that the wider needs of the district weren't able to be fed into that study. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, I think obviously, yes, there is a higher need, obviously, as a result of obviously the new NPPF, which we will be addressing in the review of the local plan. And obviously, if there is a need to review, obviously, any evidence base as part of that, we will do that. But obviously, I don't think you kind of, in a way, kind of muddling slightly. Obviously, this is a standalone study to justify, obviously, the extent of the gaps. If any evidence base needs to be reviewed as part of, obviously, our deliberations in the next local plan to obviously look at, obviously, housing allocations. And obviously, I think we talked about, obviously, there is some development within this plan that is within the settlement gap. And like I say, I think obviously it goes down to the degree that we're going to have to go to. But obviously, I think those are issues for the next local plan, which obviously we're keen to obviously start straight away upon the adoption of this plan.
Okay. I want to open it up to those people around the table, please. I know some of you have contrary views to those of the council. Okay. Please, can I turn to Littleton and Harestock Parish Council, please?
Thank you. Liz Wynne from Littleton Harestock Parish Council. One of the things that we are concerned about was obviously the exclusion of the Winchester Littleton gap from the study, and leaving it to the master plan. We feel is left things to a sort of mishmash of a conflation of buffers, a strategic gap, environmental screening all seem to be creating gaps which lead to gaps between settlements. So the gap between Littleton and Winchester is partially drawn in a subsequent document to the master plan that was actually adopted in February. So that's a new development. But there's also a potential gap between Littleton and the Sir John Moore Barracks, and we're not quite sure about the status of that and what it's trying to do. So I suppose our point is that without the policy defining what the point of the gap is and defining where the gaps are, the settlements that are supposed to be separated, it's not really clear. Allowing it by allowing a master plan to define it, it's not really clear what that is. And the other thing is that it can lead to very narrow gaps, because the one that's been presented to us most recently includes one along Kennel Lane, which is very narrow and means the gap isn't particularly meaningful. The existing gap is no longer meaningful.
Okay. Could I ask you? You heard what Mr. Fox said, that you've got extant policy. That's you've got the extant settlement gap. It hasn't been reviewed, but that's clear that that's still in place. What do you say to that?
Well, I guess that it's the one that's still in place is as it's got building in it already. Can I just kind of pass that on over to you, with Steve, actually.
Good morning, Steve Lees. I've not been here before, and can I declare an interest before we start? I wrote the push guidance on the 2008 strategic gaps, local gaps. So it's a bit odd all these years later that I'm still trying to defend it. But that said, the first thing is, can we deal with the methodology and your question about
yes, please.
Is it robust and outcomes?
Yeah.
I think the methodology is robust. I know some of the guys at LUC they have done a pretty good job. The problem that we have is that guidance isn't translated into the policy and the supporting text of NE7. And that picks up the gentleman's point down the table here about the clarity and how do you actually use this policy. If you read the policy, it's not the same as the push guidance that's actually quoted in the text of the plan which supports the policy. So I think it would be helpful if that could be resolved and clearly.
Okay. Could you just expand on that, please, and explain to me how, in what way does it not further the aims of the push guidance?
Well, if you look at NE7, and the text and the criteria where it refers to within these areas only development ... That
does not undermine the function of the gap and its intended role to define and retain the separate identity of settlements will be permitted. And then it goes on, any development should not threaten the generally open and undeveloped nature of the gap and avoid coalescence.
That isn't what para 762 of the supporting text says, which talks about it would not diminish the physical and or visual separation of settlements and it would not individually or cumulatively with other existing or proposed development compromise the integrity of the gap. So we've heard from Winchester how integral the push guidance is. They've quoted it in the text. So why isn't it in the policy? So when you come to apply the policy, so on behalf of clients, what am I looking at? Am I looking at just the policy, or am I looking at both? And the answer is I'm looking at both.
Sorry, which one are you saying is in accordance, or indeed are either of them in accordance with the push guidance?
Para 762 of the plan repeats the push guidance, the 2 bullet points.
Okay.
So if the push document is integral to the review and it's integral to the formulation of the policy, why aren't those 2 bullet points in the policy?
Okay.
And then the policy and the push guidance would then sit on all fours.
Okay, thank you for that. Please go on.
Well, just picking up what Adrian said, rule number 1 for old-time planners like me is see the site. So it's really disappointing to hear that the sites weren't actually reviewed on the ground, and there's nothing like looking at the view to decide whether it's in or out of a gap, for example. So that's sort of pretty disappointing.
But you've heard, sorry, I want you to, I don't want to continue going, but you've heard what the council have said. They've said that it's proportionate, that the local other techniques were used, and that local knowledge was actually with the sense check of the officers.
Yeah, I heard that. I'm not so sure about the proportionate, because proportionate seem to relate to the amount of resources the council wants to put into the study, not whether it's the right thing to do or not. And that's a different issue. So it seems like other matters have informed how the review has been undertaken, which weren't sort of planning matters.
Okay, do you think that, okay, you've heard what the council said. Do you think that that was robust? You've got officers there who crawled over those sites, goodness knows how many times?
Well, there's no record of the crawling to know exactly how that decision has been informed by knowledge, and site visits are the best way to do it, and a proper recording of that would be how you could then see whether it was robust and proportionate.
Okay, I think that, sorry, please, council, correct me if I'm wrong. I think what they were saying, what I was saying is that those officers obviously know the sites very well. They crawled over them for years. They did a sense check. They challenged luck.
Yeah, I'm sure they did, but we haven't seen any of that.
Okay, I understand your point.
And then if you then follow that train of thought and we're straying into that other question, when you actually look at how the policy is applied, I can't understand how you get to the proposal in the master plan for effectively 2 gaps, whether you want to deal with that now or later, but they're not applying the policy correctly in approving and endorsing the master plan.
Okay, I'm not going to, I just want to make it clear, I'm not going to deal with that matter. We've already dealt with that when we dealt with W2. So, but in terms of the settlement gap policy and the methodology, sir.
That's right. But all I'm saying is, and I certainly don't want to open up that debate, when you then see how the 2 policies are going to be applied, you come with a very odd outcome that's not consistent with the policy. So in terms of how the plan is working, and again, the gentleman's point down the end, it's not working very well. And we say that because we've seen the outcome of it in the master plan. No. So that's why I mentioned the master plan.
No, absolutely, I understand. Yeah. Okay. Is there any other?
Well, there might be, but I'll wait till others have spoken.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lees. Could I turn to Bargate Homes, please, Mr. Burton?
Thank you, ma'am. We've structured it based on your questions 1, 2, and 3. Would you like me to do 1 and then pause, or I was going to do 1 and 2?
Go on.
I'll do them in 1 hit. So I guess our response is really picking up the point about justification and proportionate evidence. And it's clear that in defining the extent of the gap, no more land than is necessary to prevent coalescence should be included. I think there's agreement on that. And in the LUC gap review report, it's clear that it's envisages this as a comprehensive review. That's paragraph 1.4. It makes no reference to any subsequent studies or verifications of the findings. So this is it, and this is what the policy is based on. And in that context, we think that the evidence base is not robust. I'm going to touch on, we've highlighted a number of elements in our response, Mum, but I'm just going to touch on scope and then methodology. In 3.2 bullet 1, the LUC report references the assessment encourages all land where development has some degree of potential to reduce separation. This includes all land between settlements rather than just the land currently defined as settlement gaps. That's what they say. But then earlier in paragraph 1.9, it's clear that the council had discounted establishing new gaps, and we think there's a slight ambiguity about the brief there. And indeed, it goes on under paragraph 1.10 to state the council will review this position if and when new development proposals are put forward and could inform the need for a new gap to be considered. And effectively, I think what we're saying in terms of the scope is that this is a bit back to front, because it raises the potential of new settlement gaps being created in the future in response to new development proposals, rather than the LUC report providing a comprehensive reappraisal of the settlement gaps and a definitive spatial strategy that feeds into the policy. And we think that the scope is ambiguous in that regard. In terms of the methodology, there's quite a bit that's duplicated in the report. And in fact, it's quite limited in actually what it defines. We generally were not clear whether there was a site visit or not, and we've put that in our representations. Obviously, that's now clear. Rather like the other gentleman, we feel that's a very significant omission.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the strength of a gap, taking into consideration its contribution to settlement setting, the degree of physical and visual separation, and the extent of urbanizing features, our view is that that can only sensibly be assessed by going to site.
Okay.
And you have other issues that you pick up in terms of tranquility, perception, and also the sequential approach that you go through a landscape. And obviously things like Google Map, I don't disagree that that's very helpful. But you don't get visibility from footpaths from Google Map, or if you do, it's just very isolated. And a lot of the interaction between the gaps is in public rights of way, which, you know, I think the council have accepted are particularly important. So to us, that is a very significant mission. By comparison, the Eastleigh Borough Council gap did the baseline assessment, went to site, produced field sheets and photographs, and reviewed and amended their initial recommendations. If you go to site, having done the desktop, it is very unusual not to modify and refine your proposals because you learn more. And so inevitably that omission, I think, it has not allowed that kind of next normal stage. And there are terms like views are likely to be available in the report. And I think that's maybe an indication of the fact that they weren't verified on site. On a separate matter, the report rightly plots on the allocated sites, but there's no information about the master plans. And so, for example, the Winchester Kingsworthy Headbourne gap, there's no information on the Barton Farm scheme in the report, even though it's largely built out now, or a good proportion of it is, and simple photographs to explain a point would have illustrated why that's relevant. Okay. And that's just an example. The last thing that I just wanted to raise in terms of question 1 is really on page 15, it says a precautionary approach has been adopted, in which suggestions alternates may include some land where, subject to the nature of specific proposal, it may be possible to demonstrate that development would not significantly affect the key features identified as being important. Sorry, I know that was a bit of a mouthful, but the point I'm trying to make is that going back to the original function of the study, it shouldn't include any more land than is strictly necessary. Whereas that seems to be suggesting that they've taken a precautionary approach, included the land, and it will dealt with through the development process. And again, perhaps if a more thorough assessment on site had been undertaken, that could have been refined. So in our view, the settlement gap study needs to be reviewed and updated as part of the local plan. Mon question 2, which is just shorter in terms of the methodology, states that assessing the strength of the gap, taking into consideration its contribution to settlements and degree of physical and visual separation, and extends the extent of urbanizing influences. In doing this, it takes into consideration the likely impact of allocated and permitted development. So it's very clear that what they're saying is in doing this study, they have taken that into consideration. So it does seem to us slightly anomaly to then exclude to not review 2 sites because they've got development proposed within them. That's not what the study set out to do. And to finish, really, it feels like it's the wrong way around. This settlement study should provide a comprehensive spatial strategy by which it is then possible to make an assessment of any development proposals either adjacent or within them. And the fact that the report is not overly transparent about the way that it's done or has additional information to support it means that it's likely to make the process difficult going forward.
Thank you very much. Could I turn to DIO?
Yeah, good morning, Mom. Rob Gardner on behalf of the DIO. A few points of reassurance, hopefully. The first point to make is around the sort of concept and status of these settlement gaps. My understanding was that we were dealing with that in abstract today as a conceptual theoretical point. We do seem to have strayed into some quite detailed analysis of that. So by all means, bring me to heel if I go too far into the detail rather than the abstract.
Okay, what I don't want to hear about is the master plan, etc. for W2.
Understood. Yeah. Although you have heard that from others, but understood. Okay. So the first thing, the premise of it, as we've said previously, it has no basis in formal planning guidance. The guidance that is used, the premises it prepared in 2008, is now very old. I don't know what statutory status that has. I suspect pretty much none. And it has produced the relevance of that. It has produced that guidance has produced a settlement gap in respect of the Sir John Moore site, where you've got a very large chunk of built development within the middle of a settlement gap. Now, I don't think that's how it was envisaged. Does that suggest it's not fit for purpose, or does it suggest this is a special case, as Mr. Fox has mentioned? But I think that's pretty important to make that point. My view of this is that it isn't a statutory thing. It is entirely in the council's gift to deal with this as it wishes to. It's not breaching any statutory guidance, and I think we are a very, very long way from any kind of breaching of the test of soundness that you reminded us all of this morning when we started. Turning next to harm in the context of this one, we're not suggesting, I don't think anybody's suggesting that any development on our site would go in any of the bits which are undeveloped at the moment. So from our perspective, to give you reassurance, we believe we could submit a planning application tomorrow and comply with the settlement gap policy, because we're not contemplating proposing anything outside of it. So I think that will hopefully that will reassure you that if there is a perception of harm to others in the room, we don't think that's reasonable. And then the third one is we're actually proposing some changes to the gap, which increases size and make it bigger. So we're actually suggesting there are benefits to this in the wider picture. That's it. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Can I turn to Chamber of Commerce, please?
Brian Joseph. Can I ask you a question first of all? In the SBR report, there are recommendations to make alterations. Is the council accepting those?
Okay, well, that can be your question.
Very good. Then moving on, if you look at the gaps and the way they've been treated, and St John's Moors is a classic example. If the council wants a bit of development in a gap, there is development. You've identified yourself Ravenswood, 200 houses next to Knoll. How does that work? Then other development, Barrett's get 91 houses in Swanmore. So if you go through all of the different gaps, and I can take you through them all, then, for example, School Lane, Kingsworthy, the inspector found that the gap wasn't an issue, it didn't underline the function. What does that mean? Should the gap boundary then be moved, or what does that tell the public? Then you go to the next one.
You don't need to go through them all, please.
I'm just making the point that all of them have breaches. 7 out of the 9 have breaches where inspectors have either concluded they don't affect the function, whatever that may mean, or the council's made allocations in them. So why don't we just have a straightforward spatial strategy and drop the gap policy?
Okay, thank you.
Turning to Wellbourne, madam, I attend the Wellbourne Community Forum. I have no memory of the open space that's been discussed this morning in that. And Wellbourne itself has its own buffers. So around the entirety of the site, it has its buffers. So, for example, the Wickham, Knoll, Wellbourne gap in Winchester cannot adjoin Wellbourne because there's already a buffer. So what I think the open space needs to be looked at more critically where it's come from. It seemed to me just to be a blanket prevention of development. Then I don't believe gaps should ever be introduced. Can I just bring you to one point I'd like to make, which in an appeal in 2021, the inspector said, when he dismissed my development, at the hearing, the appellant made strong submissions to the effect that the settlement boundary had been incorrectly defined. It was further alleged that the council was biased towards major developers, which it is, illustrated by its willingness to amend settlement boundaries to allow large-scale development on the edges of settlers. The inspector says such matters are not for consideration in the context of the Section 78 appeal and should be pursued as part of the process of preparing the next local plan. Well, here I am, and I'm in your hands as to whether you say anything about that.
Sorry, about what?
His recommendation that I came here today, seeking a change to the boundary.
Okay.
And sorry to bore you, but if I could go back one further stage, in 1998, and I've attended all the previous subsequent local plans, this is what the examination in public, chaired by Duncan Ousley QC, said. The Meon Gap clearly serves a strategic purpose in separating the major built-up areas of South Hampshire, with Southampton to the west and Fareham to the east, but is too extensive, takes in 6 kilometres of the coastline, where the risk of coalescence is virtually nil, notwithstanding the other coastal policies in the county structure, which the City Council suggests the gap should be extended northwards beyond the railway and reach up to Wickham. This is a case of extending a gap to find a settlement when the motorway, let alone the railway, is the appropriate physical barrier. That was ignored. 2004, the Meon Gap was introduced 4 years later. There shouldn't be any gaps in Winchester District.
Okay. Hear your point.
Thank
Thank you. Vivid, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. James Isles at Provision. I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made about methodology. So my point I'd like to emphasise is slightly zooming out, and your question you posed to the council at the beginning of this section is very pertinent, we think, and I don't think you got a clear answer from the council on that. I think that the answer to your question, your earlier question about does the settlement gap review consider development, it quite clearly doesn't. The LUC report quite clearly states the scope given to it was to not consider development. So I think that point is clear.
Sorry, what do you mean by consider development?
The level of development, it was a development off. So
Okay.
it was an abstract, it was an assessment of gap without any consideration of development
No,
need.
I understand that. Okay.
So I think that point is very,
Yeah.
very clear. Then considering the timing of the reports, the gap review was published at a very similar time to the development strategy paper. So it's very unclear in our minds about how the two have interacted. So if the scope of the LUC report quite clearly was not to consider development, and surely the development need should have been considered through the development and site selection strategy. The timing of the reports indicates that that wasn't possible and hasn't happened. I understand and hear the comment, I think, from Mr. Fox that this is a matter for the next local plan. It's very relevant for the next local plan, but that doesn't mean it's not relevant for the plan now. Development need is crucial for the consideration of the gap policy now. So the indication that it hasn't been a consideration is rather a concern. It is not something to be deferred to the next plan. And just to elaborate that, if you find that further sites are needed to address the shortfall now, surely the gaps have to be reviewed. If sites need to be considered now, further sites to remedy that problem now, the evidence base is lacking unless a review of the gaps is done now with development need in mind.
Thank you. Macro, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. That dovetails quite nicely into what I would like to say on this point. Dealing firstly where Mr. Owls left off, I agree entirely that this seems to be a cart before horse affair in terms of the way that the gaps have been looked at. It hasn't been an assessment that's then been used to see whether relaxation of the gaps would relinquish development opportunities that would represent the best and most sustainable options. And we can see that through the site's assessment process. I won't go into detail on that one, Ma'am. You mentioned specifically Wickham earlier, the Wickham Knoll and Wellbourne Gap. I've made very comprehensive representations on this point, and I'd like to draw you specifically, if I can, please, to examination document RP03, which is the Wellbourne Plan, and page 173 of that Wellbourne Plan, which shows very clearly the extent to which the Wellbourne Plan understood and deliberated where there would be gaps within Winchester's district. There are two very small hatched areas on that particular document, which is, as I say, page 173, Appendix B2, which show one small gap, which is south of Wickham and sits largely over the grouped woodland corridor, and then the second gap down towards Knoll itself. We also have in the dark green, just for reference if anyone wants to look at it, the settlement buffers which are included within Fairham's plan area. At no point within the Wellbourne Plan does it stipulate that there is a defined and agreed extent of gap that matches what is shown in WK3 or what is being advocated for under NE7 at Wickham Knoll and Wellbourne here. The two cannot be reconciled at all. The gaps that are shown in the Wellbourne Plan are much smaller. They are of a scale which appropriately, as you've heard from others in the room today, represents the extent of gap that was necessary to perform the strategic function of those gaps. As you've heard from the gentleman in the corner there, having prepared the policy himself, the purpose of this is to ensure that the settlements are not coalesced. It's not to include much broader landscape or include otherwise aspirations that land's used for open space purposes that we talked about when we discussed WK3. The way that the interplay works between WK3 and NE7 is of extreme concern to us here.
WK3?
WK3 is the Wellborn open space.
Oh, yes.
And I refer to the two, obviously,
Yeah.
Ma'am, because they are identical, basically, in their function. What we have here is a policy that then purports that the
Yes,
land
I don't
is
want to
allocated
go
for that
over
purpose. I understand.
WK3.
I understand that, Ma'am. That's not a problem at all. So I think from our perspective on this, the extent of the gap is excessive. It doesn't represent what is reasonable or necessary here at Wellborn. The approach which has been taken in respect of the site, and I draw attention specifically to the settlement gap topic paper document and paragraph 1.7, where it's asserted that the reason the gap hasn't been assessed is because planning permission has already been granted for the development of Wellborn. Well, fundamentally, surely this is the right time to review that gap, in which case, because we know what the extent is. And that particular approach is completely at odds with the approach that's been taken to Littleton, because we're now saying, well, okay, we're not going to review that one because the development is still taking place there, but we're not going to review this one because the development is already consented and we already know what its parameters are looking like. It's completely inconsistent, Ma'am. They should have been looking at an approach here which reviewed all of the settlement gaps. I appreciate resourcing is clearly a matter which the authority has to give some credence to, but not when it is looking fundamentally at what is the correct spatial strategy for a plan area. You should be putting resource into reviewing settlement gaps. Thank you, Ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I can't see that nameplate. Peter Nicholas.
I'll just start again. So my clients have concerns that the settlement gap review methodology is not robust or logical. Just looking at the approach that's set out in the settlement gap review, they acknowledge there's no specific guidance, and I think others at national level, others have said that. The other point to make is the review was undertaken before the current NPPF was issued, and it's based on past experience of settlement gap studies that are very dated. I mean, we're talking about PUSH, which is 17 years old, but there is also reference to studies that go back to 2000 in the review document. However, they were consistent in their approach to settlement gaps, that their function was to prevent coalescence of settlements and not for wider purposes. And I think it's really important it doesn't stray into those wider purposes. The current assessment was framed to consider whether gaps should be altered to either include additional land or exclude land that no longer perform the functions that they were expected to perform for maintaining settlement separation. And P&H considered there are a number of flaws in this assessment which undermine its robustness. So looking at the first of these, in terms of urbanising influences, and I know a number of people have mentioned that around the table today. So one of the criteria used to assess the gaps was the degree of urbanising influences, and that's set out in paragraph 3.7. And the actual urbanising influences are specified in paragraph 3.18, and they refer to urban infrastructure, residential and employment development, and peri-urban uses such as horse paddocks and formal recreation facilities. Many of these types of uses are present in the Denmead gap, including on my client's land. And the impact of these urbanising influences appears in the study to be given little attention, whether they could be removed to facilitate development without compromising the function of the gap. And the main focus, particularly in Denmead, seems to be the merit of extending the gap north of Denmead. So that lack of rigorous appraisal of the urbanising land in the existing gap and whether it strongly contributes to the function of avoiding settlement coalescence and maintaining openness is considered a significant weakness. The next point I want to make in terms of flaw is the out-of-date approach. So although I recognise we're not in a greenbelt situation, there are a lot of parallels with settlement gaps. And it could be argued that settlement gaps draw their inspiration for a greenbelt policy. Both seek to avoid coalescence and maintain openness. The key differences between the two are as one is statutory and the other is not.
The other one is Greenbelt policy has recently been updated to facilitate development in sustainable countryside locations where there is unmet need and significant infrastructure can be provided. I appreciate Winchester is not a Greenbelt authority and the current plan is being examined under a version of the NPPF that predates these changes.
That's right. That's right.
However, I would argue that the government's new approach to Greenbelt remains a material consideration for Winchester's settlement gap policy. And this is due to the council's very significant housing shortfall against the new standard methodology. And then thirdly, thinking about the lack of consistency of approach to settlement gaps in development, we undertook a very quick review of settlement gaps and allocations, which identified a consistency in approach. And there were 4 examples of allocated sites sitting in settlement gaps. And one of those, others have mentioned, St John's Moor Barracks, is a very significant incursion into that gap. And it fills the whole of it. And then I understand the council are proposing to amend the boundary to include the new development within the settlement boundary. So question.
Sorry, what did you say, the council?
I understand the council are proposing to amend the settlement boundary once permission's been given.
Right, yeah.
So
sorry, is there, sorry, how much more have you got?
That would just one.
If you don't mind, and I ask everybody in light of time, please can you be succinct in your comments?
Sure. I've only got one more point.
Thank you.
Sorry. So my client's question is, why is it acceptable to accommodate for settlement gaps to accommodate growth in these cases, and not for settlements like Denmead, where sustainable growth can be accommodated and development in the existing gap help to protect the openness of the countryside and perpetuity and improve public access to green infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much. Could I just go to Margate, please?
Hi, I'm Nia Powis at Tor & Co.
Please use your microphone.
Okay. I just want to say I agree with the other points that were raised regarding the restrictiveness of the gap in terms of Winchester's housing targets and the unmet need of neighbouring authorities.
Yeah.
But I've just got some points regarding your question 3 about whether it fits into the chapter.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if we're on to that.
No, go on,
but
go
I'm
on.
just conscious we're
okay.
running short on time. But as the council said at the beginning of this session, policy SB1 is obviously a strategic policy which covers all the NE policies in the local plan. As we've agreed, I think the settlement gap policy is to shape the pattern of settlements, and it's not related to the natural environmental biodiversity. Therefore, it's not a good fit in this location. And my second point is just in relation to how the NPPF deals with the green belt and conserving and enhancing the natural environment, which is in 2 separate chapters, at chapter 13 and chapter 15. So in order to be consistent with national policy in the spirit of soundness, I think the same should be applied here.
Okay.
That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, back to the council. Please, I'm particularly interested in this, a point that's been made that the policy doesn't accord with the push guidance. And if you look, paragraph 7.62 was brought to our attention. What does the council say about that, please?
Thank you, Ma'am. Perhaps I'll start off. Obviously, 7.62 does say, obviously, very clearly that obviously it would be the role of individual plans to identify the location, the gaps, include policies to set out. What it's not saying is local plans need to rigidly follow the push guidance. Basically, it's the starting point, isn't it, for that assessment? That's what we've done. Obviously, we've taken into account, obviously, our situations here in terms of Winchester District, appeal decisions and things like that, and obviously crafted that policy in that way. So we'd obviously say that's what paragraph 7.62 says. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that or another point, Ma'am.
No, please carry on.
Again, sorry, Mum. Again, it's a question of looking at substance rather than just words. I personally struggle to see what really is the distinction between the policy wording defining and retaining the separate identity of settlements, which is the policy, and then the gloss or the interpretation, which is provided by 7.62. I mean, how else bluntly would one seek to assess those matters which are set out in the policy wording, other than by application of the kind of considerations which are set out at 7.62? So again, we would say it's a question of substance rather than wording, form and wording.
Okay, you've heard a couple of other comments about methodology. Have you got anything to add to that?
Only that it's disappointing. Obviously, there's a difference of professional view in terms of how we should go about a study. Obviously, we've relied on LUC, who are a competent company. They do this work. It's kind of their bread and butter. Obviously, clearly, Eastleigh took a slightly different view, but we took a professional judgment, obviously based on what LUC's advice was as part of that tendering process we took to obviously commission this study. So I think there's just a difference of professional view there.
Okay. Okay, what about the point that was made that you've taken a precautionary approach, and that actually that doesn't accord with the principle to include only the land that's absolutely necessary to be included?
So, sorry, was it a proportional precautionary?
Precautionary.
Yeah, I think obviously that LUC have done obviously their independent assessment of it. Obviously they came up with some recommendations, and obviously we looked at those and obviously decided for transparency that we would keep those recommendations in. But obviously we took the view as officers that we didn't want to implement obviously some of those recommendations, and that's within our gift to do that. When we get a consultant's report, we don't have to rigidly follow all the recommendations a consultant gives us.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Is there anything else that the council would like to pick up on anything that was said? No, Mr. Lees, did you want to say one last thing?
Yes, if I may. It relates to paragraph 16 of the MPPF, and in particular 16D, which talks about local plans should contain policies that are clearly written and unambiguous, so it is evident how a decision maker should read the development proposals. Okay. What we have here is W2 and NE7 are two conflicting policies, and that's reflected in the policies map. And I think that doesn't satisfy 16D.
Okay, Art, can I put that to the council?
I think that's part of the obviously the planning balance that will be taken into consideration when we get obviously a planning application for the St John Moore Barracks, and obviously the application will need to be supported by the necessary information, which no doubt will be discussed at length at the planning committee. But like I say, that's not necessarily an issue, I don't think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Now it's 1:15. We're over time. What I'm intending to do is to continue sitting if everybody's comfortable with that. Just looking around the table. We'll sit, I don't know how much longer. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 policies. They aren't policies that I have a great deal of questions on. So is everyone comfortable with that? What I would intend doing is putting a message out to put this afternoon's session back, because we only have one participant. Is everyone comfortable with that?
Yes, I'm very much so. I was going to say we do need a little bit of time at lunch for some preparatory work for this afternoon, as well as the office.
We all do. We all do.
So
okay. So we'll do that. If I could just ask Jill, could you please contact the participant and explain that we'll be.
I think if it helps, I think Historic England will be coming at lunchtime, so
that's what I thought.
we could obviously have a word with them if that helps. But I'm sure that won't be a problem.
But we will need to put something up on the website to say. Okay. I think reasonably speaking, if we say 2:30. 2:30. Okay, so that gives us a very clear indication of how much time we've got here. Hopefully we'll give you more than that. Okay. And I don't, if anybody around the table has said what they wish to say and doesn't need to sit through the rest of it, please feel free to leave us. Okay, let's move on, please. Could we just move on to special trees, important hedgerows? That's policy NE15. It deals with special trees, hedgerows and ancient woodlands and sets out when removal will, please if you could leave as quietly as possible. Sets out when removal will be permitted and what is required of proposals affecting trees and woodland. So the first question is, does that accord with 186C? Please, anyone from the council?
Thank you, Ma'am. So policy NE15 is intended to provide enhanced protection for trees, hedgerows and ancient woodlands. The policy, particularly criteria I, ensures the retention of protected trees, woodland and hedgerows unless there are exceptional circumstances and where it has been demonstrated that it is avoidable for their removal, which accords with paragraph 186
okay.
PPF.
Okay, get that. NE15(1), the removal of protected trees, groups of trees, woodland or hedgerows will only be permitted in exceptional circumstances. Does that accord with 186C?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Yeah, tree officer, John Bartlett, tree officer. Yeah, I think it does accord with that.
That's dealing with the development resulting in the loss or deterioration of irreplaceable habitats, which includes ancient woodlands, etc.
Yeah, so it includes ancient woodland and veteran trees, and explains that there are wholly exceptional circumstances, but we also agree with the definition in the glossary is word for word of what's in the NPF.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well that brings me on to you're suggesting some MMs. That brings me on to those. You've suggested them as AMs, actually. So yeah. Those are, could you just explain that, please? And while you're there, could you say there are other definitions that could be included? Ancient woodland, special trees, important hedgerows, distinctive ground flora, should those be included?
That's correct, Ma'am. So as you rightly stated, we've proposed some definitions as additional modifications. So we've added a definition of special trees to provide clarification in the glossary. And we've also amended the definition of veteran tree to include ancient tree. So that aligns with the definition in the NPPF.
Sorry, that's an additional mod, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. That's correct.
Where are those, please?
Should be on the website, I hope.
I think, Ma'am, they're
you.
They're additional to the addendum because obviously this is a live document. So
have I got a copy of this?
You haven't. I apologise. I don't think you've got a copy of that. So,
okay.
So we will have to add those if you're happy to the it's basically trying to keep this document live.
Yeah.
So if you want,
Could you add them to the
we could add them
addendum?
to
Thank
the
you.
addendum. Sorry about that.
And then get those
to the
put up
programme
on the
also.
website.
Yeah.
So just talk me through those, please, because so special trees, okay?
So so the plan includes paragraph 7.108 of policy NE 15 defines special trees.
Yeah.
And it does include we have included a definition there, and also the reason we've included that as a proposed mod, so it's actually also in the glossary as well to provide clarity for the policy.
Okay.
We've also included a mod to an additional mod.
Sorry, are any other definitions required? Do you think?
That's what I was going to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Move on to. No, that's fine. Yeah. In relation to distinctive ground flora, I mean, in terms of that definition, ground flora is simply defined as plants growing at ground level on the forest floor, and there's likely to be that which includes one or more ancient woodland indicator species. We don't really consider that this definition is to be necessary for the purposes of soundness, because ground flora is a well-used term and something which would be recorded as part of an ecological survey, so we don't feel that that is necessary to be defined in the plan.
Okay. Okay, are there any other modifications? You've got one in relation to it is concept master plans. It's required for significant development sites identified through the pre-application process. Or is that not in relation to this policy? Is that
no, I don't.
The glossary in relation.
Yeah,
That's it. There's more changes to the glossary.
Okay, okay. Thank you. And so is the last point on this policy, is guidance on the removal or replacement required? Anything within the policy there?
Just to answer your question there, Mum, the removal and replacement is covered already within criteria I of the policy. So
criteria 1, is it?
Yeah, criteria 1 of the policy.
Trees, groups of trees, woodlands will only be in accordance with relevant good practice recommendations and where it has been demonstrated to be unavoidable.
And also in paragraph 7.107 as well.
Okay. Okay, I don't have any more questions on that policy. Does anybody else? Let's move on to nutrient neutrality. Does somebody want to introduce this policy, please?
Thank you, Ma'am. So policy NE 16 on nutrient neutrality serves a clear purpose, and that planning permission will only be granted provided the integrity of designated sites are not adversely affected from the increased production of wastewater as a result of development. Policy criterion 1 and 2 sets out requirements for ensuring development is nutrient neutral, and criteria 3 provides the mechanisms for allocating land for nutrient mitigation schemes in the plan area.
Okay, and in terms of development and overnight development, how are you dealing with that? I think you've got an MM, haven't you?
That's correct. So PM 203 or MM MM 29 amends the policy to refer to overnight development in line with advice from Natural England, which applies to overnight development only.
Okay, and 16.1. Plan permission will only be granted where the integrity of nationally protected sites is not adversely affected by new development.
In terms of the definition,
repetition of national policy.
Bear with me a moment, Mom. So in terms of our response, it serves a clear purpose, as I've already mentioned.
Yeah.
But paragraph 7.11 of the plan makes clear the type of development the policy applies to, but also policy NE16 is in line with paragraph 181 of the NPPF, which takes a strategic approach to maintaining and enhancing networks of habitats by ensuring that there are no impacts on the integrity of designated sites in relation to water policy. Policy is also in accordance with paragraphs 185A and 185B.
Okay, what about the local, well, you've got a number of MMs for this policy, haven't you?
That's correct.
Could you introduce those and tell me why they're necessary?
So these are in relation to response from Natural England and the proactive work that we've undertaken with them, which has been recorded in the Statement of Common Ground, and also the additional work that was carried out through the HRA appropriate assessments. So there's an addition of the word "and nitrogen" in paragraph 7.112, which is for clarity to confirm that the relation to nutrient issues relates to both phosphorus and nitrogen.
Yeah.
And in paragraph 7.115, there's an additional sentence there that any nutrient mitigation schemes should be brought forward with Natural England. And that's just to recognise that any schemes coming forward should be agreed with Natural England through the discretionary advice service process. Yeah. There's also a new paragraph to be inserted in paragraph 7.115 in relation to developers making positive contributions towards the local nature recovery network, in particular the identified priorities when they come through from the local nature recovery strategy.
Yeah. And this policy, it's been agreed with Natural England?
That's correct. It's been agreed through the Statement of Common Ground.
Yeah.
And also something additional as well. Yes, there's an additional one. I've given the representations that we've had through the hearing statements, through the addendum to the proposed modifications. There's a couple of additional mods there, Ma'am. So there's an additional sentence in the supporting text for 7.114, which we've now set out to highlight that details of available and suitable third-party mitigation schemes are provided on the council's website.
Yeah.
And there's a link to the relevant nutrient page, which then signposts developers to the schemes, the council-owned schemes, and also third-party schemes that are highlighted in the Partnership South Hampshire website. And there's also additional policy text in criterion 2, which sets out how developers can ensure that they are the schemes are nutrient neutral by either providing an on-site solution agreed with Natural England or a financial contribution that would go towards that third-party scheme.
Okay, which is addressing the point that's been made.
That's correct.
Okay, I don't have any further questions on that policy. Does anybody wish to raise anything? Okay, let's move on to NE17. Would the council like to introduce this policy, please?
Thank you, Ma'am.
Got a number of MMs.
Yeah. So policy 17 sets out the requirements for development proposals in relation to rivers, watercourses or their settings, and provides the mechanisms for development to conserve and enhance water quality and quantity, groundwater features and surface water features. The policy also provides the mechanism for protecting Solent Wader and Brent Keys sites.
Yes, exactly. And there's this point about watercourse corridor. Is that the watercourse corridor and the water course, is that set out in the, could somebody help me please, is that set out
do you
in
mean
the supporting text? It's at 7.120.
So that's set out in criteria 2 in policy NE 17, Mum.
Yeah. Criteria 2, ability of groundwater, surface water features and waterfall corridors to function as natural flood management areas. Is the corridor of watercourse can be defined as, is that in the glossary or is that the only reference to it? I don't think it's needed. No. Don't think it needs to be. No.
No.
Okay. And you've got some MMs on this policy, haven't you?
That's correct, Mum. So I'll just run through those.
Well, and could you justify why they're required?
Can indeed. So paragraph 7.118, there's additional text there in relation to an ecological survey where the 3 years classification of a Brent Goose and Waders site is disputed.
Yeah.
So this is in response to Natural England's representations and providing clarification and completeness in relation to the Solent Wader and Brent Geese strategy and the HRA process. So any development coming forward which will impact these sites directly or indirectly will require an HRA and should provide mitigation in line with the Solent Wader and Brent Geese mitigation sites. This includes low use sites. It's also a requirement of the strategy that should site classification be disputed, as set out in the supporting text, reclassification of a site would only be considered if confirmed by 3 consecutive years of winter surveys to the agreed methodology under appropriate habitat management conditions for Wader and Brent geese usage through the survey period.
Okay.
And then the new paragraph that's been suggested after current 7.123 in relation to the creation of buffer zones at a minimum of 10 metres. So this was as a result of comments from the Environment Agency, and the justification for the 10 metres was from the report produced in 2020 by the EA and Forestry Commission about buffer strips. The executive summary states that a buffer of 10 to 12 metres should be effective in situations of greater upslope pollution pressures, but also the BNG watercourse metric also uses the 10 metre buffer as a threshold for impacts.
Okay, are there any more?
There's also reference in the policy to the SAC compensatory habitats,
Yeah.
which is a result of the further work that was undertaken by the council in relation to comments from Natural England, but the fact that the compensatory habitats have now been confirmed by Natural England.
Yeah.
I think it was in March 2025. So that provides the link then in relation to those designated sites. And then there's an additional criteria in relation to the natural buffer zones, which relates back to the sort of supporting text.
So that the creation of adequate natural buffer zones between riverbanks, watercourse banks and any built development should be kept free of any structures to allow the natural watercourse environment to flourish.
That's
which
right.
goes back to 1.20. 7.120. And then another one, the lost habitat identified.
Yes, that's in relation to any development come forward that potentially would impact the Solent Wader Brent Geese sites would require a project level HRA. And if identified that they do have an impact, mitigation compensation should be provided in line with the strategy.
Okay, does anybody have any comment on that policy, please?
Thank you.
Winak?
Thanks very much indeed. I just wanted to bring to your attention Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust statement about enhancements to protecting chalk streams. And they have offered a integrated chalk stream protection form of wording for the local plan. Interesting enough, it indicates a natural buffer which is 20 metres, 50 to 100 metres for sensitive habitats, and so on. There's a whole form of words here, which I wonder whether is worthy of consideration, given what we're trying to achieve with the local plan. I provided a copy of that to Ms Goldsmith, and I wonder whether that could be considered.
Okay, could I ask the council in relation to the buffers?
Thank you. I think where we've agreed that with the Environment Agency, and as I've stated, that we've got that guidance from the EA and Forestry Commission about the buffer strips, but also because it's stated in the BNG watercourse metric that a 10-metre buffer is appropriate. I think that's appropriate really for the policy in terms
Okay,
of
so you
maintaining
haven't
that.
got any reason to deviate
No.
from that. Okay, I hear what you say. Okay, thank you very much. So can we turn to the remaining policies? So the first one deals with green and blue infrastructure, and we have touched on this policy already. The policy supports development that maintains, protects and enhances the functioning integrity of the existing GI network, blue and green corridors, or integrity of existing, enhances the function or integrity of existing GI, and then says that development should provide a measurable gain, and it refers to the urban greening factor. Now, I don't need any help on that. Same point that I raised in relation to the map. Are you suggesting an MM in that regard?
Thank you, Mum. So in terms of map 9 depicting the illustrative green links and blue corridors, the council's interactive policy map includes all of the green links and blue corridors,
Okay,
including
so it's already on the policies map.
yes. So PM 197 in the schedule of proposed mods proposes additional text to the preamble of policy NE4 to help improve the clarity in terms of signposting to the policy map.
Okay, I am. Okay. So the requirements with regard to off-site contributions for green and blue corridors, are those clear?
Thank you, Mum. The council consider these are clear in the policy. So the approach to secure on or off-site open space is on a case-by-case basis, recognising the size and nature of the schemes.
Where does it say about recognising the size and nature of the scheme? Because sorry, carry on.
I think it's really, again, it's to be addressed really on a case-by-case basis, Mum. I'll let Mr. Dunbar Dempsey.
Well, I just had a thought, just looking at the wording in NE4, I picked up, I think it's the second paragraph where it begins provide a measurable net gain.
Yeah, and it says appropriate for the
in accordance with the categories and standards specified in NE3. So I think there's a link there to those open space typologies, which includes natural green space. In effect, all those open space typologies can be classified as a form of green infrastructure, if you will. So I think that's a useful link to the standards in terms of getting enough quantity out of new development.
Okay, and it says and standards as specified and appropriate for the scale of development.
Yeah.
Tell me, what about these other requirements? Protect and support the proposals that facilitate future uses and enhancement of non-motorised travel, and where it can be established that on-site provision is not possible, financial contribution. Yeah, what about those? What would trigger those?
So the requirement for supporting and enhancing non-motorised routes are a response from South Downs National Park in relation to the Reg 18 consultation. And the policy text was added to safeguard those routes, disused railways and watercourses. So it would be proposals that are within.
But what would trigger them? Would that be every? I mean, the policy, local planning authority will support development that. Is any additional flexibility required there?
I think what we were trying to do there, Marm, is obviously we've got a lot of disused railway lines in the district, and obviously on the advice from the South Downs National Park, they were keen to obviously make sure those disused railway lines, which are a lot of those, were not used obviously by motorised traffic. So we were trying to basically wrap that up because they are also green infrastructure as well.
Would where appropriate or something be appropriate?
Sorry, could you just elaborate where the?
Sorry, it said that the policy says local planning authorities will support development that, and then it says protect and support proposals. That won't be relevant to. I mean, some of these won't be relevant. The point I'm making is some of these won't be relevant to all types of development, will they? And should additional flexibility be built into it? That's another what I'm saying.
I think we could add where appropriate to the protect and support proposals. I think I think it probably is.
Okay.
To be fair.
Okay. Can I ask you to look at that, please? In relation to that policy, and then you've got a number of MMs. One in relation to heritage, that's historic parks, scheduled monuments, registered battlefields. And you've got a reference in paragraph 7.34, including features of heritage significance. Why are those necessary?
Thank you, Mum. So in relation to the additional text under 7.32 to reference scheduled monuments, registered battlefields, and also 7.34 including features of heritage significance. Those are acknowledge the role of scheduled monuments and registered battlefields in the context of green infrastructure. So we think that those are necessary. There's also an additional mod in paragraph 7.35 in relation to the River Itchen, just to recognise the status of the designated site. So it highlights that it's international as well as national. So that's providing clarity in relation to the River Itchen. And then in the policy text itself, we deleted the local planning authority will support and replaced it with planning permission will be granted for development proposals that maintain and protect and enhance the functional integrity of the existing green infrastructure network, and a reference to the policies map to make that clear that links are on there. We've also removed the reference to with high levels of accessibility in primary areas to provide further clarification there.
Green infrastructure shall be accessible for all and promote health. Why have you removed with high levels of accessibility in primary areas?
Because we've not defined primary areas within the supporting text, so it's providing more clarity that we get rid of that.
Okay, I understand. Okay, let's move on quickly. You've got policy NE5 that deals with biodiversity, and that requires 10% biodiversity net gain and protection of protected sites, supports for habitats in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy. What do you say about this policy and your negotiations with Natural England?
So the policy NE5 serves a distinct purpose within the plan because it addresses biodiversity matters specific to Winchester District, particularly the impacts of recreational pressure, which is not explicitly covered by national policy. It specifically refers to protecting sites of international, national and local importance, and with references to appropriate mitigation measures, which is also not included within national policy. The policy ensures that speculative development mitigates the impacts of recreational pressure on designated habitat sites in line with locally appropriate guidance, such as the Bird Aware strategy. And we consider that it serves a clear purpose, contributes to the plan's effectiveness and avoids necessary repetition of national policy.
Okay. Yeah. Get that. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say about Natural England and so in terms of the reference to including a strategic assessment of the plan from impacts for air quality, that's to ensure that air quality is taken into consideration in terms of, that's to say that the local plan even undertook a strategic air quality assessment, and the impacts of air quality in alone and in combination for the plan have been considered. And we've got that now agreed in the Natural England Statement of Common Ground.
So that's bringing it up to date.
That's right. We've got a letter of withdrawal now from Natural England to state that they no longer have an objection to the plan.
I'm aware of that. And then you've got a number of other suggestions. Have they all come from Natural England?
And Nature Space. So
which is the one from Nature Space?
That's relating to the Great Crested Newt District licensing scheme.
Yes.
I'll just expand on that. So the supporting text for the policy, paragraph 7.49, highlights the district licensing scheme for Great Crested Newts that Winchester City Council have signed up to and have available for developers, and how this also supports Great Crested Newt conservation by the creation of habitats.
Yeah, now I don't need any help with the requirement above BNG. I've looked at your viability assessment. I know, I'm aware of national policy. I don't need any help on that. Does anybody else want to raise anything? Okay, and then you've got a number of MMs that you've just referred to. Those have come forward from Natural England, and as you say, who's the other one?
Nature Space.
Nature Space. Okay, I will scrutinise it. I don't have any questions for you, but I will scrutinise those in my own time. Because you've got one in relation to functionally linked land.
Would it be helpful if I explain that?
Yes, that would actually.
So that
I've got no question. Yeah, that's criteria 4, isn't it?
That's right. So the habitats regulation assessment highlights that development could occur on functionally linked land associated with the River Itchen SAC. That includes riparian wetland habitats used by otters, lowland fens used by the southern damselfly. So the HRA identifies that there may be impacts from development in areas outside of the European site boundaries that may occur where habitat contributes towards maintaining the interest feature for which the site is designated. Although some areas of functionally linked land known, some might only be identified through ecological survey of development sites, hence the reason for the inclusion of the mod within the policy. Is to ensure that development does not have an adverse impact on the functionally linked land during the construction phase.
Okay. Does anybody else wish to say anything on that policy? Okay, then we have our last policy, or I've got it on my list of the last policies to deal with, which is in relation to flooding and flood risk. And what you say to me is that this accords with the NPPF. It's been through the rigours of the Environment Agency and Hampshire County Council, the local lead flood authority. I don't have any further questions on that policy that I can't deal with myself. I'm just looking through first. Right, sorry, I just want to ask about SUDs. So what is the evidence? You're asking for SUDs on all development. What's the evidence behind that, please?
So the National Planning Policy Frame, sorry, I'm Sarah Rajiv from the Legal
Aid Authority. I remember.
So the NPPF does require consideration of SUDs on all developments. That is paragraph 173 point C, unless there's clear evidence that it would be inappropriate. But I just want to draw back to the principles of SUDs, because it can mean slightly different things on different developments. For instance, the SUDs manual talks a lot about soakaways, so the below ground systems that are often used on single dwellings. That's considered a SUD system in the context of that sort of a development. But when it comes to major developments, you would expect to see far more consideration given to the multiple benefits, the amenity, the biodiversity, quality and quantity, which is where we would expect to see the above ground features, the swales, the ponds, the wider selection. So I just think it's important to recognise the context of the individual development, but SUDs can be delivered in some form or other.
Yes, that's actually within the policy, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, that's actually within the policy. Yeah, I have read that. Okay, could you've got quite extensive alteration to this policy. Now that's incorporating in particular comments from the Environment Agency. You've got Southern Water and you've got Heritage One. Don't bother with the Heritage One. I can deal with that myself. Could you just introduce the others, please?
Thank you, Ma'am. So there's a proposed mod in paragraph 7.55 of the supporting text in relation to Southern Water's comments to provide clarification in that a developer would not be permitted to undertake work on Southern Water infrastructure. Water companies will assess capacity in relation to proposed development during the planning process, and any capacity constraints will be managed through the regulatory funding mechanism and for the reinforcement of the network. Currently that's through the infrastructure charge, so it's necessary to provide a signposting to that in the supporting text. There's also a proposed mod in the wording of criteria 8 in policy NE6 to ensure no net loss of floodplain storage capacity. And that's to provide additional further clarification in terms of the natural flood management proposals.
Okay. Is there anything else that anyone would like to say on that policy? Winnack?
Yes, if I may, perhaps there's a question for Sarah Hampshire. Sort of clarify, you mentioned SUDS and you talked about circleways and so on, but what about other secondary and tertiary systems? And I'm thinking about reed beds, grey water, rainwater harvesting, particularly using attenuation methods to slow down the unpredictable nature, changing climate and water levels, which is something that I've seen having to be done close to the River Meon in particular. So I wonder if we can comment on that and whether there's any need to strengthen to make this plan more sound. Thank you.
Would that come within the realms of the policy?
In my belief, it will. So the requirements of the NPPF, the guidance that we work to, the guidance that we have as well as a League Local Flood Authority, we do require developments to manage surface water. Major developments this is for our role. To manage surface water within their site boundary, up to and including the 1 in 100 plus climate change, which is up to an additional 45% added on to the rainfall intensity. So in our view, that standard of drainage system is best practice. It's what we expect them to work to, and we are seeing the developers working to that quite effectively.
Okay, Mr. Fox.
Thank you. Just to add to what Sarah said, is again reading the plan as a whole. CN1 criterion 9 talks about water use management and conservation. It talks about rainwater and grey water harvesting, picking up on the councillor's point there about extreme weather, etc. So I'm hoping obviously the plan will be read as a whole, because criteria 9's policy CN1, which we haven't discussed yet, obviously does deal with that.
Okay. Could I ask that any discussion takes place? If you need any further clarification, it takes place outside this room. Okay, it's now 2 o'clock, and I'm sorry that session has overrun, but there were important things that we had to consider. Right, 2 o'clock. What I'm intending to do, let's have the full 45 minutes. I need a break. I'm sure that you do as well. So if we start again at 1:45, I'll deal with the practicalities of that. If you wouldn't mind just giving
Historic England are actually in the building, my colleague's team.
Perfect. We'll be back in the room at 2:45. Can I just thank participants very much for your contributions? Very helpful in me coming to my conclusions. So thank you very much. Okay, this session's now closed.